For more than 3,000 years, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt pursued a singular obsession: the defeat of death itself. They commanded the construction of monuments that still stand today, developed preservation techniques of remarkable sophistication, and filled hidden tombs with treasures meant to last for eternity. Yet despite their power and their preparations, mystery surrounds them still. Who are these god kings? What secrets do their mummified remains hold? And what can modern science reveal about their lives, their deaths, and the elaborate rituals they believed would carry them into immortality? Tonight we'll explore the world of Egypt's pharaohs and the mummies they left behind. This isn't a journey built on speculation or sensationalism, but on decades of archaeological discovery, scientific analysis, and scholarly research. We'll examine the evidence that archaeologists have carefully documented, from Howard Carter's methodical excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb to the DNA studies that have rewritten royal family trees. We'll consider the work of Egyptologists, forensic scientists, and historians who have dedicated their careers to understanding these ancient rulers. But this is also a human story of individuals who suffered from disease, navigated family politics, and faced the same mortality we all confront even as they try to transcend it. We'll move through this history carefully, taking time to understand not just what happened, but what it meant. These are subjects that deserve patience and attention. There's no need to rush through millennia of civilization. We'll examine the evidence, thoughtfully consider different perspectives, and acknowledge what remains unknown. The mysteries of ancient Egypt have waited thousands of years. They can wait for us to explore them properly. Our journey tonight will take us through 14 chapters, each revealing a different aspect of pharaonic Egypt and its mummies. We'll begin with the discovery that changed everything: Howard Carter's 1922 excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb, the only substantially intact royal burial ever found, and what those 5,000 artifacts revealed about ancient Egyptian burial practices. Then we'll examine what modern science has discovered about the boy king himself, the CT scans and DNA analysis that revealed his physical disabilities, genetic disorders, and the likely cause of his death at age 19. We'll investigate the famous curse that supposedly killed those who opened the tomb, separating sensational journalism from the real, biological dangers that ancient tombs can harbor. Next, we'll explore the reign of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who upended Egyptian religion, and how his radical revolution set the stage for Tutankhamun's restoration of the old gods. We'll follow the mystery of Queen Nefertiti, her unprecedented power, her sudden disappearance from historical records, and the ongoing search for her burial place, which may lie hidden behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. We'll examine the sophisticated science of mummification, how the process evolved over thousands of years, what chemicals and techniques the embalmers used, and what their methods reveal about Egyptian understanding of preservation and the afterlife. Then we'll discover what modern medical imaging reveals when we look beneath the wrappings, the diseases, injuries, and genetic information that royal mummies have preserved for millennia. We'll encounter Ramesses the Great, who ruled for 66 years, built monuments across Egypt, and became the most prolific pharaoh in Egyptian history. His propaganda so successful we still speak his name 32 centuries later. We'll uncover the dramatic story of the royal mummy cache, how one family secretly plundered a hidden tomb containing dozens of pharaohs for years, and what that discovery revealed about ancient efforts to protect royal burials from tomb robbers. We'll explore the Valley of the Kings itself, why pharaohs chose this remote location, how the elaborate tombs were constructed, and why nearly everyone was robbed in antiquity. We'll examine how DNA analysis has rewritten royal family trees, revealing the genetic consequences of generations of inbreeding and identifying family relationships that historical records left unclear. We'll meet the remarkable women who ruled as pharaohs particularly Hatshepsut, whose successful reign was later erased from monuments, and what these female rulers reveal about power and gender in ancient Egypt. We'll survey recent archaeological discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding, from lost cities emerging from the sand to new technologies revealing hidden chambers in ancient monuments. And finally, we'll reflect on what the pharaohs and their mummies reveal about humanity's eternal struggle with mortality, and why ancient Egypt continues to fascinate us thousands of years after the last pharaoh died. Let's begin. The Boy King's untouched tomb. On November 4th, 1922, the Valley of the Kings lay quiet under the Egyptian sun as it had for thousands of years. Howard Carter, a British archaeologist, had been searching this barren landscape for nearly 6 years, funded by his patron Lord Carnarvon. They were looking for one tomb in particular, that of an obscure pharaoh named Tutankhamun, who had ruled Egypt briefly during the 14th century BCE. Most experts believed there was nothing left to find. The valley had been thoroughly explored, its tombs catalogued, and almost without exception robbed in antiquity. Carter's funding was running out, and this was to be his final season. Then on that November morning, a young Egyptian water boy named Hussein Abdel Rasul was clearing sand near the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses the Great when his stick struck something solid. It was a stone step cut into the bedrock and buried beneath centuries of debris. Carter was summoned immediately. As workers carefully cleared the sand, more steps appeared descending into the limestone. By the next day, they had uncovered 12 steps leading to a sealed doorway. The plaster seal bore the necropolis emblem, a jackal above 9 bound captives, indicating this was indeed a royal tomb. But Carter examined the seals carefully and found cartouches bearing the name Tutankhamun. After years of searching, he had found his target. The discovery posed an immediate dilemma. Carter wanted desperately to break through and see what lay beyond. But his agreement with Lord Carnarvon required that his patron be present for the opening. Carnarvon was in England, thousands of miles away, so Carter made a decision that would define the entire excavation. He would wait. He had the stairway refilled with rubble to protect it, posted guards, and sent a telegram to England. It would take Carnarvon 3 weeks to arrive. Those weeks must have been agonizing for Carter, knowing that beyond that sealed door lay either treasure or more likely another plundered tomb. Lord Carnarvon arrived on November 23rd, accompanied by his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. The stairway was cleared again, revealing the full doorway. Carter noted with concern that the upper left corner showed signs of ancient resealing evidence that tomb robbers had entered at some point in antiquity. His hopes for an intact tomb dimmed. Nevertheless, on November 26th, workers broke through the doorway and began clearing a descending corridor filled with limestone chips. This rubble fill was a good sign. It suggested the tomb had been officially resealed in ancient times. After clearing 30 feet of corridor, they encountered a second sealed doorway, also bearing Tutankhamun's seals, and also showing signs of ancient breach and repair. Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner of this door and inserted a candle. The flame flickered in the stale air that had been sealed for over 3,000 years. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that took his breath away. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him in the narrow passage, asked impatiently, "Can you see anything?" Carter's response would become one of archaeology's most famous quotes, "Yes, wonderful things." What Carter saw in that first glimpse was a room filled with objects, gold gleaming in the candlelight, strange animal shapes, overturned chariots, and alabaster vases. It was immediately clear that this tomb, while not completely untouched, was substantially intact. The next day they enlarged the opening and entered what would be called the antechamber. The room measured roughly 12 by 26 feet and was packed with objects in apparent disorder. 3 elaborate golden couches with animal-shaped legs dominated the space, one with cow heads, another with lioness heads, and a third with heads of a creature that was part hippopotamus, part crocodile, part leopard. Beneath these couches were stacked boxes, chests, chairs, stools, and walking sticks. 2 life-size statues of the king, covered in black resin and gold, stood guard on either side of what appeared to be another sealed doorway. Carter's training and discipline became crucial at this moment. Rather than rushing to explore further or remove objects, he organized a systematic documentation process. Every item would be photographed in place, drawn, catalogued, and carefully conserved before removal. He brought in Harry Burton, a photographer, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Alfred Lucas, a chemist who would handle conservation. The Egyptian government assigned an inspector, Rex Engelbach, to oversee the work. This methodical approach meant the excavation would take nearly 10 years to complete, but it also meant that Tutankhamun's tomb would become the most thoroughly documented archaeological discovery of its era. As they catalogued the antechamber, the wealth and variety of objects was staggering. There were 3 golden couches designed to hold the king's body during mummification rituals. There were chariots, not ceremonial models, but full-sized vehicles that showed signs of actual use, their wooden frames covered in gold leaf and decorated with battle scenes. There were boxes containing clothing, sandals, and jewelry. There were alabaster vessels that still contained dried oils and unguents. There were board games, senet and chow, that the king had presumably played in life. There were weapons, bows, arrows, throw sticks, and daggers, including one with a blade made from meteoric iron, a material more precious than gold in the Bronze Age. On February 16, 1923, nearly 3 months after the initial discovery, Carter was ready to open the sealed doorway guarded by the 2 statues. A crowd of officials and dignitaries gathered in the tomb. Carter carefully removed the stones blocking the doorway and peered into the chamber beyond. What he saw was a wall of gold, a massive golden shrine that filled nearly the entire burial chamber, leaving only a narrow corridor around its edges. This shrine, they would later discover, was the outermost of 4 nested shrines, each one covered in gold and inscribed with protective texts. Inside these shrines was a quartzite sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 nested coffins, the innermost made of solid gold weighing 243 pounds. And inside that golden coffin lay the mummy of Tutankhamun, his face covered by the famous golden mask that has become the iconic image of ancient Egypt. The tomb contained over 5,000 individual objects. Beyond the antechamber and burial chamber, there were 2 additional rooms, the annex, which was packed with furniture, food, wine, and oils, and the treasury, which contained the king's internal organs in a golden shrine, along with jewelry, religious objects, and 2 small coffins containing the mummified bodies of 2 premature infants, likely the king's stillborn daughters. What made this discovery so significant wasn't just the gold, though there was certainly plenty of that. It was the completeness of the assemblage. Here was everything the ancient Egyptians believed a king would need in the afterlife: furniture, to sit on beds, to sleep in clothes, to wear food, to eat, games to play, chariots to ride, weapons to hunt with, and religious objects to aid his journey through the underworld. The tomb was in effect a 3-dimensional textbook on ancient Egyptian burial practices and beliefs about the afterlife. The discovery also raised profound questions. Tutankhamun was a minor pharaoh who ruled for only about 9 years and died at approximately age 19. He accomplished little of historical significance during his reign. His tomb, while impressive, was actually quite small by royal standards, just 4 rooms carved into the valley floor. If this was what a minor king received, what must the tombs of truly great pharaohs like Ramesses II or Seti have contained? Those tombs, unfortunately, had been thoroughly plundered in antiquity, their treasures melted down or scattered. Only Tutankhamun's tomb, hidden beneath rubble from the later construction of Ramesses the Great's tomb, had escaped major plundering. The tomb had been entered by robbers, probably within a few years of the burial. Evidence showed 2 separate break-ins. The robbers had been after specific items, oils, unguents, and precious metals that could be easily carried and sold. Officials had discovered the robberies, restored some order to the tomb, and resealed it. Then when Ramesses the Great's tomb was constructed about 75 years later, workers building huts at the entrance dumped their rubble directly over Tutankhamun's tomb entrance. The location was forgotten, and the tomb remained hidden for over 3,000 years. Carter's excavation sparked worldwide fascination with ancient Egypt. Newspapers covered every development. Fashion designers created Egyptian-inspired clothing. Architects incorporated Egyptian motifs into buildings. This Egyptomania brought ancient Egypt into popular consciousness in a way no previous discovery had. The golden mask of Tutankhamun became and remains one of the most recognizable artifacts in the world. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb reminds us that sometimes the most important historical revelations come not from the powerful and famous, but from the obscure and forgotten. The boy king accomplished little in life, dying young and leaving no significant military victories or architectural achievements. Yet his death and the accident of his tomb's preservation gave him an immortality far beyond what he could have imagined. His legacy is not what he did, but what he left behind, a window into a world that would otherwise remain largely hidden from us. In the Valley of the Kings, where mighty pharaohs built elaborate tombs to ensure their eternal remembrance, it was the forgotten boy king whose name would echo loudest through the millennia. The Mummy Beneath the Mask. When Howard Carter finally lifted the golden mask from Tutankhamun's face in October 1925, 3 years after discovering the tomb, he found the mummy in troubling condition. The body was dark, brittle, and stuck fast to the bottom of its golden coffin. The resins and unguents poured over the king during burial had carbonized over the millennia, essentially gluing the mummy in place. Carter's team had to use heated knives to separate the body from the coffin, a process that caused significant damage. They then systematically unwrapped the mummy, photographing and cataloging 143 objects, amulets, jewelry, and protective charms that had been placed between the layers of linen. What they found beneath the wrappings was a body that raised more questions than it answered. For decades, speculation swirled about how this young pharaoh had died. The theories ranged from murder to accident to disease. Some suggested he had been assassinated, struck on the head by political rivals. Others proposed he died in a chariot accident or from an infection. Without modern technology, Carter and his team could only observe and speculate. The mummy showed no obvious cause of death, though they noted the king appeared to have been about 18 or 19 years old at death, based on bone development and tooth eruption patterns. The mummy remained in its tomb for most of the 20th century, occasionally examined, but never thoroughly studied with modern methods. That changed in 2005 when Egyptian authorities authorized the first CT scan of Tutankhamun's body. A team led by Dr. Zahi Hawass, then Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, brought a portable CT scanner into the Valley of the Kings. On January 5, 2005, they carefully removed the mummy from its coffin and performed over 1,700 digital X-ray images, creating a complete three-dimensional map of the king's body. The results were revealing. The scans showed that Tutankhamun stood approximately 5 feet, 6 inches tall, a normal height for the ancient Egyptian males. His skull was intact with no evidence of the head trauma that some murder theories had proposed. However, the scan did reveal a significant leg fracture. The king's left femur, the large thigh bone, showed a severe break just above the knee. The fracture had occurred shortly before death. There was no evidence of healing suggesting it happened within days of his passing. More concerning, the break appeared to have penetrated the skin, creating an open wound that would have been highly susceptible to infection in an era before antibiotics. The scan also revealed other physical problems. Tutankhamun's left foot showed signs of necrosis, dead bone tissue, consistent with a condition called Kolar disease. This disorder causes the bones of the foot to deteriorate, making walking painful and difficult. The king's spine showed a mild curvature, a form of scoliosis. His chest had an unusual shape, with the ribs on one side being slightly longer than the other. His teeth showed a pronounced overbite, a characteristic feature of the royal family of the 18th dynasty. These findings helped explain one of the tomb's mysteries. Why did it contain 130 walking sticks? Carter had cataloged these canes carefully, noting that many showed signs of use, their tips worn down from contact with stone floors. The CT scan suggested that Tutankhamun needed these walking aids. He wasn't the vigorous young warrior depicted in the tomb's painted scenes, shown hunting from his chariot or smiting Egypt's enemies. He was a young man who struggled to walk, who relied on canes to move around his palace. In 2010, a more comprehensive study was undertaken. A team of Egyptian and German researchers, led by Dr. Pharaoh and Dr. Karsten Pusch from the University of Tübingen, conducted DNA analysis on Tutankhamun's mummy, along with 10 other royal mummies from the same period. They extracted DNA from bone samples, a painstaking process, given the age and condition of the tissue. The genetic analysis took over 2 years to complete, with multiple samples tested to ensure accuracy. The DNA results were startling. They confirmed what historians had long suspected: Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, both children of the pharaoh Amenhotep III. The study identified Tutankhamun's father as the mummy, known as KV-55, found in a small tomb near Tutankhamun's, almost certainly the pharaoh Akhenaten. His mother was identified as the younger lady mummy, found in tomb KV-35, an unnamed daughter of Amenhotep III. Brother and sister had produced a son, and that son bore the genetic consequences of such close inbreeding. The DNA analysis revealed several inherited conditions. Tutankhamun carried genetic markers for Kolar disease, explaining the bone necrosis in his foot. He also showed signs of a cleft palate, though this was mild and may not have affected his appearance significantly. The accumulation of genetic disorders from generations of royal intermarriage had created a physically fragile individual. Egyptian royal families practiced sibling marriage to keep the bloodline pure and to consolidate power, but the biological cost was high. The 2010 study also tested for ancient pathogens. Using a technique called molecular pathogen screening, researchers searched for DNA from infectious diseases. They found evidence of malaria parasites, specifically Plasmodium falciparum, the most severe form of malaria. The presence of this parasite didn't necessarily mean malaria killed the king, but it indicated he was infected at or near the time of death. Malaria was endemic in ancient Egypt, transmitted by mosquitoes breeding in the Nile's irrigation channels and marshes. Putting these pieces together, researchers developed a likely scenario for Tutankhamun's death. The young king, already weakened by genetic disorders and chronic foot pain, suffered a severe leg fracture. Perhaps he fell, or perhaps he was injured in an accident, possibly while hunting or riding in a chariot, activities depicted in his tomb despite his physical limitations. The fracture broke through the skin, creating an open wound. In the hot Egyptian climate, such wounds infected rapidly. Bacteria entered his bloodstream. His immune system, already compromised by malaria and genetic conditions, couldn't fight off the infection. Sepsis set in, and within days the young pharaoh was dead. The research also revealed something unexpected about the burial itself. Close examination of the famous golden mask showed tool marks and alterations. The ears had been pierced for earrings unusual for a male pharaoh, but common for royal women and children. The face showed signs of modification. The cartouches, the oval frames containing the king's name, had been altered, with one name changed to another. These details suggested that the mask hadn't been made for Tutankhamun at all. It had likely been created for someone else, possibly his immediate predecessor, the mysterious pharaoh Nefertiti, who many scholars believe was actually Queen Nefertiti, ruling under a throne name. When Tutankhamun died unexpectedly, officials hastily adapted existing funerary equipment for his burial. This theory gained support from other objects in the tomb. Some of the coffins showed similar modifications. Certain items bore names that had been changed. The small size of the tomb itself suggested it hadn't been prepared for a pharaoh. Everything pointed to a rushed burial, organized quickly after an unexpected death. Tutankhamun's successor, who had been his vizier, needed to bury the young king and legitimize his own claim to the throne. There wasn't time to prepare proper royal funerary equipment, so they used what was available, modifying it as necessary. Modern imaging has also revealed details about the mummification process itself. The embalmers removed Tutankhamun's brain through his nose, as was standard practice. But they also removed his heart, unusual for royal mummies, as the heart was supposed to remain in the body for judgment in the afterlife. A scarab amulet was placed in the chest cavity as a symbolic replacement. The embalmers used enormous quantities of resin, far more than typical for royal burials. This excess resin, combined with the hot Egyptian climate, caused a chemical reaction inside the sealed coffins. The mummy essentially combusted at low temperature, charring the skin and causing much of the damage Carter found. The body also showed evidence of hasty embalming. The arms were positioned incorrectly. The penis had been mummified separately and attached at an unusual angle. The wrapping was less careful than expected for a pharaoh. All of this supported the theory of a rushed burial. Tutankhamun had died unexpectedly, and his funeral was organized in haste. Recent research has continued to refine our understanding. In 2014, a virtual autopsy using the CT scan data suggested that Tutankhamun might have had a clubfoot, not just Kohler disease. In 2019, researchers analyzing the chemical composition of the resins found that they came from distant sources: frankincense from the Horn of Africa, cedar oil from Lebanon, indicating that even in a rushed burial, no expense was spared for royal funerary materials. What emerges from all this scientific investigation is a portrait very different from the golden mask's serene, idealized features. Tutankhamun was a young man born into a family weakened by generations of inbreeding. He inherited genetic disorders that affected his mobility and overall health. He lived with chronic pain, relying on walking sticks to move around. He contracted malaria, a disease that would have caused recurring fevers and weakness. Then in his late teens, he suffered a catastrophic leg injury that led to a fatal infection. His death was sudden enough that proper burial preparations couldn't be completed, forcing officials to adapt existing funerary equipment and rush through the mummification process. The scientific study of Tutankhamun's mummy has transformed him from a mysterious ancient king into a real person, whose life we can understand in remarkable detail. We know his height, his health problems, his family relationships, and even the diseases he suffered from. The golden mask that made him famous presents an eternal, perfect image of divine kingship. But beneath that mask lay a fragile young man whose body tells a story of genetic consequences, physical suffering, and the very human vulnerability that even pharaohs couldn't escape. The boy king's mummy reminds us that behind the gold and the glory, the ancient Egyptians were people who faced the same biological realities we do: illness, injury, and mortality. the curse that wouldn't die. The legend began with a death. On April 5th, 1923, just 4 months after the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo's Continental Hotel. He was 56 years old, and the official cause of death was blood poisoning and pneumonia triggered by an infected mosquito bite on his cheek that he had accidentally reopened while shaving. It was a mundane end for the man who had funded the greatest archaeological discovery of the century. But mundane deaths don't sell newspapers, and within hours of Carnarvon's passing, the story began to transform into something far more sinister. The initial reports were dramatic enough. Carnarvon's son, who was at his father's bedside, later claimed that at the exact moment of death, all the lights in Cairo went out. The city did experience a brief power failure that night, not an unusual occurrence in 1923 Cairo, but the timing seemed too coincidental to ignore. Then came an even more theatrical detail. Back in England at Highclere Castle, Carnarvon's beloved fox terrier, Susie, supposedly howled and dropped dead. At the same moment her master expired thousands of miles away. Whether this actually happened remains unverified, but it made for compelling reading. The newspapers seized upon these stories. Within days, headlines proclaimed the curse of the pharaohs and warned of ancient Egyptian revenge against those who had disturbed the boy king's rest. The novelist Marie Corelli, popular at the time, wrote to the press claiming she owned an ancient Arabic text that warned of dire consequences for anyone who entered a sealed tomb. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes and a devoted spiritualist, suggested that Carnarvon's death might have been caused by elementals or supernatural guardians created by ancient Egyptian priests to protect the tomb. The media frenzy intensified as more deaths were attributed to the curse. When George J. Gould, an American financier who had visited the tomb, died of pneumonia a few months later, newspapers added him to the curse's victim list. When Prince Ali Kamal Fahmy Bey of Egypt was shot by his wife in London's Savoy Hotel, some papers suggested the curse had driven her to murder. When Lord Carnarvon's half-brother, Aubrey Herbert, died of blood poisoning, it was attributed to the curse despite the fact that he had never visited the tomb. The list grew with each death, no matter how tenuous the connection to Tutankhamun. Reports emerged of an inscription found in the tomb, supposedly reading, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." This warning was quoted in newspapers worldwide and became central to the cursed narrative. There was only one problem: no such inscription existed. Howard Carter and his team had meticulously photographed and catalogued every inscription in the tomb, and none contained any curse or warning. The phrase appears to have been invented by journalists, or possibly by guards at the tomb site who enjoyed frightening visitors. Another supposed curse inscription was said to have been found on a clay tablet in the tomb reading, "They who enter this sacred tomb shall swift be visited by wings of death." Carter did find clay tablets, but they contained mundane administrative texts, not curses. Some accounts claimed Carter himself had hidden or destroyed curse inscriptions to prevent panic. This theory ignored Carter's character. He was a meticulous archaeologist who documented everything and would never have destroyed evidence. The curse narrative gained such traction that it overshadowed the actual archaeological significance of the discovery. Carter became increasingly frustrated with the sensationalism. In his writings, he addressed the curse directly, calling it Tommy rot, and pointing out that the ancient Egyptians would never have placed curses in tombs, as doing so would have endangered the priests and workers who needed to enter for burial rituals and offerings. The ancient Egyptians did believe in protective magic, but it was designed to keep the deceased safe from harm, not to harm the living. Yet the curse story persisted, and it persists still nearly a century later. Why? Part of the answer lies in human psychology and our attraction to mystery and the supernatural. But examining the actual facts reveals a very different story from the one the newspapers told. Let's consider the evidence systematically. Of the 58 people present at the official opening of the burial chamber in February 1923, only 8 had died by 1934, 12 years later. That's a mortality rate of about 14% over 12 years, which is entirely normal for a group with an average age of around 50. Howard Carter himself, who spent more time in the tomb than anyone else, lived until 1939, dying at age 64 of lymphoma, 16 years after the tomb's opening. If there was a curse targeting those who disturbed the tomb, it certainly took its time with the chief disturber. Dr. Douglas Derry, the anatomist who performed the autopsy on Tutankhamun's mummy and handled the body extensively, lived to age 87, dying in 1961. Alfred Lucas, the chemist who worked in the tomb for years, analyzing materials and preserving artifacts, lived to age 78. Harry Burton, the photographer who documented every stage of the excavation, lived to age 60, dying in 1940. Lady Evelyn, Herbert Lord Carnarvon's daughter and one of the first 3 people to enter the burial chamber, lived until 1980, dying at age 79, 57 years after supposedly being cursed. A statistical analysis conducted in 1934 by a British insurance company found that the average age at death for people connected with the tomb's discovery was 70 years, which was actually higher than the general life expectancy at the time. The curse appeared to be protective rather than deadly. So what really killed Lord Carnarvon? The answer is straightforward and tragic: a mosquito bite and the medical limitations of 1923. Carnarvon had been in poor health for years, ever since a serious automobile accident in 1901 that had damaged his lungs. He was particularly vulnerable to respiratory infections. The mosquito bite on his cheek became infected, and when he accidentally cut it open while shaving, bacteria entered his bloodstream. In the era before antibiotics, blood poisoning was often fatal. Carnarvon developed pneumonia. His weakened lungs couldn't fight the infection, and he died. It was bad luck and bad timing, not an ancient curse. However, there is an element of real danger associated with ancient tombs, though it's biological rather than supernatural. Tombs, sealed for thousands of years, can harbor dangerous pathogens. Bacteria, fungi, and mold spores can survive in the dry, sealed environment and become airborne when the tomb is opened. Bat droppings, often found in tombs that have been breached, can contain Histoplasma capsulatum, a fungus that causes a serious lung infection called histoplasmosis. Aspergillus fungi, which grow on organic materials like wood and cloth, can cause severe respiratory problems. In 1986, Dr. Caroline Stenger Phillip, a physician, published research suggesting that some deaths attributed to the curse might actually have been caused by exposure to toxic molds. She noted that several people who entered the tomb, including Carter himself, suffered from respiratory problems in subsequent years. Carter's lymphoma, which eventually killed him, might have been unrelated, or it might have been triggered or exacerbated by years of exposure to mold spores and other biological hazards in the tomb. More recently, researchers have found that ancient Egyptian mummies and tomb materials can harbor dangerous bacteria, including some that are resistant to modern antibiotics. A 1999 study detected several species of potentially pathogenic molds in Egyptian tombs. Workers who spend extended time in these environments without proper respiratory protection do face genuine health risks. So while there's no supernatural curse, there is a real biological danger, not from ancient magic, but from ancient microorganisms. The curse legend also served certain purposes beyond selling newspapers. For Egyptian nationalists in the 1920s, the idea of a curse that punished foreign archaeologists for removing Egyptian treasures had political appeal. Egypt was still under British control at the time, and resentment of foreign exploitation of Egyptian antiquities ran deep. The curse narrative, even if fictional, expressed a kind of poetic justice. the pharaohs striking back at those who plundered their tombs. For the general public, the curse provided a more exciting story than the reality of careful, methodical archaeological work. It transformed a scientific excavation into an adventure tale with supernatural elements. It gave people something to discuss and debate, and it tapped into deeper anxieties about disturbing the dead and the consequences of hubris themes that resonate across cultures and throughout history. The curse has had remarkable staying power. It has been featured in countless books, films, and television shows. When Egyptian artifacts tour internationally, newspapers still run stories about the curse and whether it might affect museum visitors. When the mummy of Ramesses II was flown to Paris for conservation treatment in 1976, it was issued a passport listing his occupation as King Deceased, and some reports suggested special precautions were taken against the curse. The legend has become inseparable from the discovery itself. Howard Carter spent the last years of his life somewhat bitter about how the curse narrative had overshadowed the scientific importance of his discovery. He had conducted the most careful, methodical excavation in archaeological history, documenting everything with unprecedented precision. He had revealed treasures that transformed our understanding of ancient Egypt. Yet what captured the public imagination wasn't the archaeology, but a fictional curse invented by journalists. The story of Tutankhamun's curse reveals something important about how we process historical discoveries. We're drawn to mystery and the supernatural, even when the truth is more mundane. We prefer dramatic narratives to statistical analysis. A curse makes a better story than a mosquito bite, even though the mosquito bite is what actually happened. The curse that wouldn't die isn't an ancient Egyptian spell. It's a modern myth that continues to thrive because it offers something that facts alone cannot: a sense of wonder, danger, and the possibility that some mysteries transcend rational explanation. In that sense, the curse itself has achieved a kind of immortality, outlasting most of the people it supposedly killed. The Heretic King's Revolution. To understand Tutankhamun, we must first understand the world he inherited, a world turned upside down by his father's radical vision. Around 1353 BCE, a pharaoh named Amenhotep I ascended to the throne of Egypt during what historians call the New Kingdom, a period of Egyptian power and prosperity. He inherited an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north, a wealthy kingdom supported by tribute from vassal states and trade networks spanning the known world. He also inherited a complex religious system that had evolved over thousands of years with hundreds of gods and goddesses, powerful priesthoods, and elaborate temple rituals. Within a few years of taking power, Amenhotep III would attempt to dismantle all of it. The traditional Egyptian pantheon was crowded with deities. There was Ra, the sun god, Osiris, god of the underworld and resurrection, Isis, the divine mother, Horus, the falcon-headed sky god with whom every pharaoh was identified, Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, Anubis, guardian of the dead, and many, many others, each with their own temples, priests, festivals, and mythologies. The most powerful religious institution in Egypt was the priesthood of Amun, based at the massive temple complex of Karnak in Thebes. The priests of Amun controlled vast wealth, land, gold, and political influence that sometimes rivaled the pharaoh's own power. Amenhotep IV began his reign conventionally, enough building temples and making offerings to the traditional gods. But by his 5th year on the throne, something changed. He declared that only one god deserved worship, the Aten, represented as a sun disk with rays ending in hands that offered the Ankh, the symbol of life. This wasn't entirely new. The Aten had been venerated during his father's reign as one aspect of the sun god Ra. But Amenhotep IV took this much further. He declared that the Aten was not just the supreme god, but the only god. All others were false, their worship to cease. To mark this transformation, the pharaoh changed his own name. Amenhotep meant Amun is satisfied. His new name, Akhenaten, meant effective for the Aten, or servant of the Aten. It was a public rejection of the god Amun and everything the traditional priesthood represented. But Akhenaten didn't stop with a name change. He ordered the closure of temples throughout Egypt. He redirected their revenues to the worship of the Aten. He sent workers to chisel out the names of other gods from monuments, particularly the name of Amun, which was systematically erased from inscriptions across the kingdom. Then in year 5 of his reign, Akhenaten made an even more dramatic move. He abandoned Thebes, the traditional capital, and built an entirely new city in Middle Egypt on a site that had no previous religious associations. He called it Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten, a city dedicated entirely to his god. Today we know it as Amarna. The city was built with remarkable speed. Within 2 or 3 years, it had temples, palaces, administrative buildings, and housing for thousands of people. Akhenaten moved his entire court there, along with the government bureaucracy, and declared that he would never leave. He even had boundary stelae carved into the cliffs surrounding the city, marking its sacred limits, and recording his oath never to extend the city's boundaries beyond what the Aten had shown him. Akhenaten's religious revolution came with an artistic revolution. Traditional Egyptian art was highly formal and stylized, depicting pharaohs as idealized, eternally youthful figures with perfect proportions. Akhenaten ordered a radically different style. Images of the royal family showed them in startlingly realistic, even exaggerated ways. Akhenaten himself was depicted with an elongated skull, a long, thin face, full lips, a protruding belly, wide hips, and thin arms and legs. His wife Nefertiti and their daughters were shown in similar style, though less extreme. These images have puzzled scholars for decades. Did Akhenaten actually look like this? Did he suffer from some medical condition that caused these physical characteristics? Theories have ranged from Marfan syndrome to Froelich syndrome to various hormonal disorders. DNA analysis of the mummy, believed to be Akhenaten, has been inconclusive, showing no definitive genetic markers for these conditions. Some scholars now believe the artistic style was symbolic rather than realistic, that Akhenaten was deliberately portrayed as androgynous, combining male and female characteristics to represent the Aten's role as both father and mother of creation. What's undeniable is that Amarna art was revolutionary in other ways. It showed the royal family in intimate domestic scenes that would have been unthinkable in traditional Egyptian art. There are images of Akhenaten and Nefertiti kissing their daughters, the royal couple holding hands, the family relaxing together with children sitting on their parents' laps, Akhenaten eating a meal. These scenes humanize the pharaoh in unprecedented ways, showing him not as a distant godlike figure, but as a husband and father. The religious texts from Akhenaten's reign are equally remarkable. The great hymn to the Aten found in the tomb of Ai at Amarna is a beautiful piece of poetry that praises the sun disk as the creator and sustainer of all life. It describes how the Aten brings light to the world each morning, how all creatures depend on its warmth, how it creates diversity in humanity, and provides for all nations, not just Egypt. Some scholars have noted similarities between this hymn and Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible, suggesting possible cultural exchange, though the connection remains debated. But Akhenaten's revolution had serious consequences. The traditional priesthoods, particularly the wealthy priests of Amun, lost their power and income. They didn't disappear, they waited. The temples that had been centers of community life for centuries were closed. Religious festivals that had marked the rhythm of the year ceased. For ordinary Egyptians who had always worshipped a variety of household gods and local deities, the new religion offered little. The Aten was remote and abstract, accessible primarily through the pharaoh himself. There was no afterlife mythology associated with the Aten, no Osiris to judge the dead, no Book of the Dead to guide souls through the underworld. For a culture deeply concerned with death and the afterlife, this was a troubling void. Egypt's international position also suffered during Akhenaten's reign. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence found at the site, reveal growing problems. Vassal rulers in Syria and Canaan sent increasingly desperate pleas for military assistance against invading forces and rebellious cities. These letters were often ignored or answered with inadequate responses. Egypt's empire began to contract as Akhenaten focused on religious matters rather than military and diplomatic affairs. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's main rival, expanded its influence into territories that had been under Egyptian control. Akhenaten ruled for 17 years, an unusually long reign for such a controversial pharaoh. This suggests he maintained enough support at least within his new capital to hold power. But the situation was unstable. Nefertiti, who had been depicted as co-regent with unusual prominence in early reliefs, disappeared from the record around year 12 of the reign. Her fate remains one of Egyptology's great mysteries. Did she die, fall from favor, or as some scholars suggest, did she become co-regent under a new name, Neferneferuaten, preparing to rule after Akhenaten's death? When Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE, his revolution died with him. He was succeeded briefly by the mysterious Neferneferuaten, then by a young boy named Tutankhamun, living image of the Aden. This boy was probably Akhenaten's son, though his mother's identity remains uncertain. He was around 8 or 9 years old, far too young to rule independently. Power lay with advisors, particularly Ai, who had been an important official under Akhenaten, and Horemheb, the commander of the army. Within 2 or 3 years, the restoration began. The young pharaoh's name was changed from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. The court moved from Amarna back to Thebes. A stela erected at Karnak, known as the Restoration. Stela described the religious situation under Akhenaten. In dire terms, the temples had fallen into ruin, the gods had turned away from Egypt, prayers went unanswered, and chaos reigned. Whether this was accurate or propaganda is debatable, but it signaled a complete reversal of Akhenaten's policies. The temples were reopened and restored. The priesthoods were reinstated. Traditional religious festivals resumed. The worship of Amun and the other gods was restored with royal support. And Akhenaten's name began to be erased from monuments, just as he had erased the name of Amun. His city Akhetaten was gradually abandoned. Within a few decades it was deserted, its buildings dismantled for stone, its temples destroyed. The site would remain largely forgotten until archaeologists rediscovered it in the 19th century. Later, Egyptian king lists omitted Akhenaten, entirely jumping from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the heretic pharaoh and his immediate successors had never existed. When Akhenaten was mentioned in later texts, it was as the enemy or the criminal of Akhetaten. His religious revolution was treated as an aberration, a period of chaos that had been corrected by the restoration of proper order. Modern scholars debate what motivated Akhenaten's revolution. Was it genuine religious conviction, a political move to break the power of the Amun priesthood, a manifestation of mental illness, a response to some personal revelation or experience? We may never know his true motivations. What we do know is that his attempt to fundamentally transform Egyptian religion and culture failed. The traditional beliefs were too deeply rooted, too central to Egyptian identity, to be overturned by a royal decree, even a pharaoh's decree. Yet Akhenaten's revolution had lasting consequences. It created the circumstances that led to Tutankhamun's early death and hasty burial, which in turn led to the tomb's preservation and eventual discovery. It demonstrated the limits of pharaonic power. Even a god-king couldn't permanently change beliefs held for millennia. And it left us with remarkable art and texts that provide a window into one of history's most fascinating experiments in religious transformation. The heretic king failed in his revolution, but he succeeded in becoming unforgettable, his name and story preserved not through his own monuments, which were destroyed, but through the archaeological evidence of his failed dream. The beautiful one who vanished. In 1912, German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt was excavating the ruins of Amarna Akhenaten's abandoned capital when his team made a discovery in the workshop of the royal sculptor Thutmose. Buried in the debris was a painted limestone bust of a woman wearing a tall blue crown. The face was perfectly preserved, high cheekbones, full lips, a long, graceful neck, and eyes that seemed to gaze into eternity. One eye was inlaid with rock crystal and black paint, creating a lifelike appearance. The other eye socket was empty, left unfinished, for reasons we can only guess. This was Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one has come, and whose face would become one of the most recognized images from ancient Egypt. Yet despite her fame, Nefertiti herself remains deeply mysterious, a queen who wielded extraordinary power before vanishing from history without explanation. Nefertiti appears in the historical record around 1353 BCE as the principal wife of Akhenaten. Her origins are uncertain. Some scholars believe she was the daughter of Ai, an important official who would later become pharaoh. Others suggest she might have been a foreign princess, possibly from the Mitanni kingdom in Syria, sent to Egypt as part of a diplomatic marriage. A few researchers have even proposed she was Akhenaten's cousin. The evidence is inconclusive, and her parentage remains one of many unanswered questions about her life. What is clear from the archaeological evidence is that Nefertiti held an unprecedented position of power and prominence. In traditional Egyptian queenship, the pharaoh's wife played important ceremonial roles, but remained subordinate to her husband in official imagery and inscriptions. Nefertiti shattered these conventions. In the reliefs and paintings at Amarna, she appears constantly at Akhenaten's side, equal in size to the king, a visual statement of equal status. She is shown performing rituals that were traditionally reserved for pharaohs, making offerings to the Aten, driving a chariot, even smiting enemies, a pose that symbolized the pharaoh's role as Egypt's military protector. In one remarkable scene from Amarna, Nefertiti appears alone in the traditional pharaonic smiting pose, raising a mace to strike bound captives. This image, which would normally show the king instead, shows the queen wearing the blue crown that became her signature. She is depicted larger than the captives, demonstrating her dominance. This wasn't decorative art, it was a political statement. Nefertiti was claiming royal prerogatives, presenting herself not just as the king's wife, but as a ruler in her own right. The titles given to Nefertiti reinforce this extraordinary status. She was called Great Royal Wife, the standard title for a principal queen, but also Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lady of the Two Lands, and Great of Praises. Some inscriptions refer to her as the heiress, suggesting she may have brought legitimacy to Akhenaten's rule through her own royal bloodline. In several scenes, she wears the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, though whether this was symbolic or indicated actual co-rulership remains debated among scholars. Nefertiti and Akhenaten had 6 daughters, together all of whom appear frequently in Amarna art. Though the family scenes show an unusual intimacy, the royal couple kissing their daughters, the children sitting on their parents' laps, the family relaxing together under the rays of the Aten. These images humanize the royal family in ways that had no precedent in Egyptian art. They also reveal something about Akhenaten's religious vision. The royal family was presented as the Holy Family, the earthly embodiment of the Aten's creative power, with Akhenaten as father, Nefertiti as mother, and their daughters as proof of divine blessing. But around year 12 of Akhenaten's 17-year reign, something changed. Nefertiti disappeared from the official record. The last dated appearance of her name is in year 12 in inscriptions at Amarna. After that, she vanishes. Her name is no longer mentioned in texts. Her image no longer appears in reliefs. It's as if she ceased to exist. This disappearance has generated numerous theories, each attempting to explain what happened to Egypt's most powerful queen. The simplest explanation is that Nefertiti died around year 12. Death would certainly explain her absence from subsequent records. However, no burial or mummy has been definitively identified as hers. A tomb was prepared for her at Amarna, carved into the cliffs outside the city, but it appears never to have been used. If she died during Akhenaten's lifetime, she should have been buried there. If she died after Akhenaten during the return to traditional religion, she might have been reburied elsewhere. But where the search for Nefertiti's burial has become one of Egyptology's great quests. Another theory suggests that Nefertiti fell from favor. Perhaps she opposed some aspect of Akhenaten's religious reforms. Perhaps she was replaced by a younger wife. A woman named Kia appears in some inscriptions from the later part of Akhenaten's reign, and may have borne him a son. Perhaps political circumstances changed, requiring Nefertiti's removal from public life. However, this theory has problems. If Nefertiti had been disgraced, we would expect to see her name and images deliberately erased, as happened with other fallen officials. Instead, her earlier monuments remained intact. Her disappearance seems more like an absence than an erasure. The most intriguing theory proposes that Nefertiti didn't disappear at all, she transformed. Around the time Nefertiti vanishes from the record, a new figure appears, a pharaoh named Neferneferuaten. This ruler's name means, "Beautiful are the beauties of the Aten," echoing Nefertiti's own name. Neferneferuaten ruled briefly after Akhenaten's death before Tutankhamun took the throne. Some inscriptions refer to this pharaoh with feminine grammatical forms, suggesting the ruler was female. Could Neferneferuaten have been Nefertiti ruling as pharaoh under a throne name? The evidence is tantalizing but not conclusive. Some scholars argue that Nefertiti became co-regent with Akhenaten around year 12, adopting the name Neferneferuaten and ruling alongside him until his death, then continuing to rule alone for a brief period. This would explain her disappearance as Nefertiti. She hadn't vanished. She had been elevated to pharaoh and taken a new name, as was customary when assuming the throne. It would also explain the unusual prominence she enjoyed earlier in the reign. She was being prepared for eventual co-rulership. Other scholars are skeptical. They point out that Neferneferuaten could have been someone else, perhaps one of Akhenaten's daughters, or even a male relative. The feminine grammatical forms might be scribal errors, or might refer to the feminine form of the Aten. The evidence is fragmentary, consisting of scattered inscriptions and a few artifacts. Without more definitive proof, the identity of Neferneferuaten remains uncertain. The search for Nefertiti's burial has intensified in recent years. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves proposed a controversial theory based on high-resolution scans of Tutankhamun's tomb. He noticed what appeared to be straight lines in the plastered walls of the burial chamber, suggesting hidden doorways that had been sealed and painted over. Reeves argued that Tutankhamun's tomb was actually a corridor tomb that had been hastily adapted when the young king died unexpectedly. The tomb, he suggested, had originally been prepared for Nefertiti. She was buried there first in chambers beyond the sealed doorways. When Tutankhamun died, lacking a prepared tomb, he was buried in the outer chambers, with Nefertiti's burial remaining undisturbed behind the walls. This theory generated enormous excitement. If true, it would mean that Nefertiti's burial, potentially as rich as Tutankhamun's, or richer, lay just beyond the walls of the most famous tomb in Egypt. Radar scans were conducted in 2016 and again in 2018. The results were frustratingly contradictory. Some scans suggested anomalies behind the walls that could indicate chambers. Others found nothing. The Egyptian government has been cautious about authorizing invasive investigation, unwilling to risk damaging Tutankhamun's tomb based on uncertain evidence. Recent analysis has cast doubt on Reeves's theory. The lines he identified in the walls may simply be cracks in the plaster or features of the underlying rock. The radar results may have been affected by the tomb's complex structure and the modern conservation materials used on the walls. Most Egyptologists now consider it unlikely that hidden chambers exist behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. But the search for Nefertiti continues elsewhere. Some researchers believe Nefertiti may be one of the unidentified royal mummies already in museum collections. In tomb KV35, discovered in 1898, archaeologists found several mummies, including two females known as the Elder Lady and the Younger Lady. The Younger Lady has been identified through DNA analysis as Tutankhamun's mother, but her name remains unknown. Could she be Nefertiti? The DNA evidence suggests she was the daughter of Amenhotep III and sister wife of Akhenaten, which fits some theories about Nefertiti's origins. However, other evidence suggests Nefertiti was not Tutankhamun's mother, making this identification problematic. Another candidate is a mummy found in tomb KV21, which contained two unidentified female bodies. One of these women may have been a queen from the Amarna period. DNA testing has been attempted but has not yet yielded definitive results. The search continues complicated by the poor preservation of many mummies and the difficulty of extracting usable DNA from ancient remains. What we know with certainty is limited. Nefertiti was a queen of extraordinary power who played a central role in one of Egypt's most dramatic periods. She was the face of Akhenaten's religious revolution, depicted in art as his equal partner in transforming Egyptian religion and society. Then around year 12 of the reign, she disappeared from the historical record. Whether she died was removed from power or transformed into the pharaoh Neferneferuaten remains unknown. Her burial place, if it still exists intact, has not been found. Even her parentage and her relationship to Tutankhamun are uncertain. The famous bust that made her face iconic sits in Berlin's Neues Museum, where it has been since shortly after its discovery. Egypt has repeatedly requested its return, arguing it was taken from the country improperly. Germany has refused, claiming it was legally acquired. The dispute over the bust mirrors the larger mystery of Nefertiti herself, beautiful, controversial, and ultimately elusive. Nefertiti's disappearance reminds us how much of ancient history remains hidden from us. We have her face preserved in the limestone, with remarkable artistry. We have images of her performing royal rituals and intimate family scenes. We have her titles and her name, but we don't have her story's ending. We don't know how she died, where she was buried, or what became of her after year 12 of Akhenaten's reign. The beautiful one who came has vanished, leaving behind only questions and the haunting image of a face that has gazed across more than 3,000 years, keeping its secret still. The science of immortality. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an ending, but a transformation, a journey from the physical world to the eternal realm of the afterlife. But this journey required preparation. The body had to be preserved, protected from decay, so that the soul could recognize and reunite with it in the afterlife. Over the course of 3,000 years, Egyptian embalmers developed and refined techniques for preserving human remains that represent represent one of the ancient world's most sophisticated applications of chemistry and anatomy. What we call mummification was to the Egyptians the science of immortality. The practice didn't begin with elaborate techniques. Egypt's earliest burials, dating to the pre-dynastic period before 3100 BCE, were simple graves in the desert sand. The hot, dry conditions naturally desiccated bodies, creating accidental mummies. The sand-absorbed moisture bacteria couldn't thrive in the arid environment, and bodies dried out before they could decompose. These natural mummies, with their preserved skin and hair, may have inspired the Egyptians to believe that bodily preservation was necessary for the afterlife. When they began building more elaborate tombs with burial chambers that protected bodies from direct contact with sand decomposition, became a problem. The solution was to artificially recreate the preservative effects of the desert, to deliberately dry out the body using chemical means. The earliest attempts at artificial mummification date to around 2600 BCE during the Old Kingdom. These early techniques were crude by later standards. Embalmers wrapped bodies in resin-soaked linen, hoping the resin would preserve the flesh. Results were mixed. The resin helped prevent bacterial growth, but it didn't address the fundamental problem in internal organs, particularly the moisture-rich organs of the abdomen and chest decomposed rapidly. By the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BCE, embalmers had begun removing internal organs, significantly improving preservation. But it was during the New Kingdom from approximately 1550 to 1070 BCE that mummification reached its peak of sophistication. The process we associate with royal mummies from this period was elaborate, expensive, and time-consuming. It required specialized knowledge, specific materials, and 70 days to complete. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described the process based on what Egyptian embalmers told him. His account, while not entirely accurate, provides valuable information that archaeological evidence has largely confirmed. The process began shortly after death. The body was taken to a structure called the Per Nefer, the House of Beauty, or the Wab Tait, the place of purification. These were temporary workshops, often tents set up near the burial site where embalmers performed their work. The first step was to wash the body with water from the Nile and palm wine, purifying it for the transformation ahead. Next came the removal of internal organs. The embalmers made an incision in the left side of the abdomen, typically about 4 inches long, using a sharp stone blade, often flint or obsidian. Through this opening, they extracted the stomach, intestines, liver, and lungs. This required considerable skill. The organs had to be removed without causing excessive damage to the body's exterior, which needed to remain as intact as possible. Each organ was washed, dried, and treated with natron, then wrapped in linen and placed in special containers called canopic jars. These jars, usually made of limestone or pottery, were topped with lids representing 4 protective deities. Imsidi, human-headed, protected the liver. Happy baboon-headed, protected the lungs. Duamutef, jackal-headed, protected the stomach. And Kebesanuef, falcon-headed, protected the intestines. The heart, however, was left in place. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and memory, the essence of a person's identity. In the afterlife, the deceased would face judgment before Osiris, god of the underworld. The heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, representing truth and justice. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the deceased could enter the afterlife. If it was heavier, weighted down by sin, it would be devoured by Ammit, a demon with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, and the soul would cease to exist. The heart had to remain in the body for this crucial judgment. The brain presented a different problem. The Egyptians didn't understand its function. They considered it useless tissue that needed to be removed to prevent decomposition, but wasn't worth preserving. The extraction method was ingenious if somewhat disturbing. Embalmers inserted a long bronze hook through the nostril, breaking through the thin ethmoid bone at the top of the nasal cavity to access the cranium. They used this hook to break up the brain tissue, then turned the body face down, allowing the liquefied brain to drain out through the nose. Sometimes they flushed the skull cavity with water or palm wine to ensure all brain tissue was removed. The skull was then packed with linen or resin to maintain its shape. With the internal organs removed, the body cavity was washed with palm wine and rinsed with water infused with spices. Then came the crucial step desiccation using natron. Natron is a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, salt, and sodium sulfate. It was mined from dry lake beds in the Wadi Natron, northwest of Cairo. The chemical properties of natron made it ideal for mummification. It absorbed moisture, killed bacteria, and helped dissolve body fats. The embalmers packed the body cavity with natron and covered the entire exterior with more natron, creating a bed of the white crystalline substance. The body was left in this natron bed for approximately 40 days. This desiccation period was critical. The natron drew moisture out of the tissues through osmosis. The body lost about 75% of its weight as water evaporated. The skin darkened and became leathery. The flesh shrank against the bones. But the tissue was preserved, protected from the bacterial decomposition that would otherwise have reduced the body to bones within weeks. After 40 days, the natron was removed and the body was washed again to remove natron residue. The dried body now needed to be prepared for burial. The empty body cavity was packed with materials to restore a more lifelike shape. Embalmers used linen sawdust sand or even mud, sometimes adding aromatic substances like myrrh and cassia. In some cases, particularly for royal mummies, they packed the limbs as well, making small incisions to insert preservative materials under the skin. The abdominal incision was closed, sometimes covered with a plate bearing the image of the Eye of Horus, a powerful protective symbol. The body was then anointed with oils and resins. Recent chemical analysis has revealed the sophistication of these substances. Embalmers used complex mixtures that varied by time period and the wealth of the deceased. Common ingredients included cedar oil from Lebanon frankincense and myrrh from the Horn of Africa, beeswax, animal fats, and plant oils. These substances weren't chosen randomly. Each had specific properties. Cedar oil had antibacterial qualities. Frankincense and myrrh were aromatic and had preservative effects. Beeswax created a protective coating. The recipes were trade secrets passed down through families of embalmers. The wrapping process was equally elaborate. It wasn't simply a matter of covering the body with linen strips. The wrapping followed specific patterns and incorporated protective amulets at designated locations. The fingers and toes were wrapped individually first, then the limbs, then the torso, then the head. Between layers of linen embalmers placed amulets, small objects made of stone metal, or faience, each with magical protective properties. The scarab beetle, representing rebirth, was placed over the heart. The Eye of Horus, representing healing and protection, appeared multiple times. The Diad pillar, representing stability, was placed along the spine. The Tayat knot, representing the protection of Isis, was positioned near the pelvis. As the wrapping progressed, priests recited spells and prayers. These weren't mere formalities, they were essential to the process. The words activated the magical properties of the amulets and ensured the deceased's safe passage through the dangers of the underworld. The entire wrapping could use hundreds of yards of linen and take several days to complete. The final layer was often a shroud, sometimes decorated with images of the deceased or protective deities. For royal mummies, the process included additional elements. Tutankhamun's mummy, for example, wore a golden mask over the face, golden finger, and toe covers, and was adorned with elaborate jewelry. The wrappings contained 143 separate objects, amulets, jewelry, and ritual items. The level of wealth and craftsmanship reflected the deceased's status, but the basic preservation techniques were similar across social classes, varying mainly in the quality of materials and the time spent on the process. The entire mummification process from death to burial took 70 days. This wasn't arbitrary. It corresponded to the period when the star Sirius disappeared from the night sky, a celestial event the Egyptians associated with death and rebirth. The 70 days were divided into specific periods: initial purification, organ removal, desiccation, wrapping, and final rituals. Families of the deceased observed mourning practices during this time, and professional mourners were hired to wail and lament, demonstrating the proper grief. Modern scientific analysis has revealed just how effective these techniques were. Mummies thousands of years old still contain preserved soft tissue, skin, hair, and even in some cases internal organs that weren't completely removed. DNA can be extracted from mummified tissue, allowing researchers to determine genetic relationships and identify diseases. Chemical analysis of the resins and oils reveals trade networks spanning thousands of miles. The mummies are in effect time capsules, preserving not just bodies, but information about ancient Egyptian medicine, chemistry, trade, religion, and daily life. The Egyptians didn't think of this as science in our modern sense. They understood it as a sacred ritual, a necessary transformation that allowed the deceased to achieve immortality. But it was science nonetheless, a systematic application of chemical and anatomical knowledge to achieve a specific goal. The embalmers were practical chemists who understood which substances prevented decay, which absorbed moisture, and which created protective barriers against bacteria. They were skilled anatomists who knew how to remove organs without destroying the body's form. They were engineers who solved the problem of preservation through careful observation, experimentation, and refinement of techniques over centuries. The science of immortality didn't grant eternal life in the way the ancient Egyptians hoped. No mummy has awakened to walk in an afterlife of endless wheat fields under a perfect sun. But in an unexpected way, the embalmers succeeded. They preserved the bodies of the dead so completely that we can study them thousands of years later, learning about the lives of people who died before the pyramids were old. They created a form of immortality, not spiritual but scientific and historical. The mummies speak to us across millennia, their preserved flesh telling stories that would otherwise be lost forever. In that sense, the ancient Egyptian embalmers achieved exactly what they intended. They defeated death, not by preventing it, but by preserving what death left behind. What the wrappings hide. For more than a century after the first Egyptian mummies were brought to Europe, studying them meant destroying them. In the 19th century, public unrollings were popular entertainment. A mummy would be placed on a table before an audience, and a physician or antiquarian would systematically unwrap the linen bandages, narrating the process as layers were removed. These events were treated as spectacles, sometimes held in theaters with admission fees. The mummy's wrappings were often distributed to audience members as souvenirs. The body itself, once unwrapped and examined, was frequently discarded or ground up for use in paint pigments or folk medicines. Countless mummies were destroyed this way, their potential to provide scientific information lost forever. Even when the unwrapping was done with scientific intent, the process was irreversible. Once the bandages were removed, they couldn't be replaced in their original configuration. The careful layering, the placement of amulets, the patterns of wrapping, all this information was lost. And the mummy itself, exposed to air and humidity after millennia of protection, often deteriorated rapidly. By the mid-20th century, Egyptologists recognized that unwrapping mummies destroyed more information than it revealed. The question became, how could researchers study what lay beneath the wrappings without removing them? The answer came from medical technology. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays, and within months, researchers realized these rays could penetrate solid objects and create images of their internal structure. By the 1960s, X-ray examination of mummies had become standard practice. For the first time, researchers could see inside wrapped mummies without unwrapping them. They could identify amulets, examine bone structure, and detect some soft tissue features. But X-rays had limitations. They produced two-dimensional images that compressed all the internal structures into a single flat picture, making it difficult to distinguish overlapping features. And they provided limited information about soft tissues. The next breakthrough came with computed tomography, or CT scanning, developed in the 1970s. CT scanners use X-rays but take multiple images from different angles, then use computer processing to create detailed, three-dimensional reconstructions. By the 1990s, CT scanning of mummies had begun in earnest, and the results were revolutionary. Researchers could now examine every aspect of a mummy's interior bones, teeth, soft tissues, wrappings, and artifacts with unprecedented clarity. They could virtually unwrap mummies, removing layers digitally to see what lay beneath, then reconstruct them without causing any physical damage. What these scans revealed transformed our understanding of ancient Egyptian life, health, and death. The mummies weren't just preserved bodies, they were medical records, genetic archives, and biographical documents written in bone and tissue. One of the most significant findings has been the prevalence of disease in ancient Egypt. The popular image of ancient Egypt as a land of health and vitality doesn't match the evidence from mummies. Dental problems were nearly universal. The bread that was a staple of the Egyptian diet was ground on stone mills, and tiny particles of sand and stone ended up in the flour. This gritty bread wore down teeth to the pulp, causing abscesses and infections. CT scans show that many mummies had severe dental disease, with abscesses visible in the jawbone. These infections would have caused chronic pain, and in some cases may have contributed to death through sepsis. Arthritis was common, particularly in the spine and major joints. This isn't surprising given the physical labor required in ancient Egypt, hauling stone, working in fields, carrying heavy loads. Even royal mummies show signs of arthritis. Ramesses II's mummy reveals severe arthritis in the spine and hips. Amenhotep III suffered from such severe arthritis that he could barely walk in his later years, according to diplomatic letters that mention his inability to stand for long periods. Atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, has been found in numerous mummies, including those of people who died relatively young. CT scans can detect calcified deposits in blood vessels, indicating cardiovascular disease. A 2013 study examined 137 mummies from different time periods and geographic locations, finding evidence of atherosclerosis in more than a third of them. This suggests that cardiovascular disease isn't just a modern problem related to diet and lifestyle, but has been affecting humans for thousands of years. Parasitic infections were endemic in ancient Egypt. The Nile, which gave Egypt life, also harbored parasites. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasitic worms that live in freshwater snails, was widespread. These parasites penetrate the skin of people wading or swimming in infected water, then migrate to the blood vessels around the intestines or bladder, causing chronic inflammation and organ damage. Evidence of schistosomiasis has been found in many mummies. Another common parasite was the guinea worm, which grows up to 3 feet long inside the human body and must be slowly extracted through the skin, a painful process that can take weeks. Malaria, as we've seen with Tutankhamun, was present in ancient Egypt. DNA analysis has detected malaria parasites in several mummies. The disease would have caused recurring fevers, weakness, and in severe cases, death. The combination of malaria with other health problems, malnutrition, parasitic infections, injuries would have been particularly dangerous. Cancer has also been identified in mummies, though it appears to have been less common than in modern populations. A 2011 study found evidence of prostate cancer in a mummy from around 2250 BC, making it one of the oldest known cases. Bone cancer has been detected in several mummies. The lower cancer rates in ancient populations may reflect shorter lifespans. Many people died from infections or injuries before they were old enough to develop cancer rather than any protective factor in ancient lifestyles. CT scans have also revealed the injuries and violence that ancient Egyptians experienced. Fractures are common in mummies. Some healed others that occurred near the time of death. Ramesses. Pharaoh's mummy shows the knife wound that killed him. Hidden beneath the wrappings, evidence of the assassination plot mentioned in historical texts. Sekenenre-Tao, a pharaoh from the 17th dynasty, has a mummy that shows catastrophic head injuries. His skull was fractured by at least 2 different weapons, likely an axe and a spear. He probably died in battle, and his body was hastily mummified, perhaps on a battlefield, before being brought back for proper burial. Some injuries tell stories of survival and ancient medical treatment. One mummy shows a leg fracture that healed with the bones properly aligned, suggesting the use of splints. Another shows evidence of trepanation, a hole drilled in the skull, possibly to relieve pressure from a head injury or to treat headaches. The bone around the hole shows signs of healing, indicating the patient survived the procedure. These findings reveal that ancient Egyptian medicine, while limited by lack of knowledge about infection and anatomy, was more sophisticated than often assumed. DNA analysis has added another dimension to mummy studies. Since the 1980s, researchers have been extracting and analyzing ancient DNA from mummified tissue. This is technically challenging. DNA degrades over time, and contamination from modern DNA is a constant risk. But when successful genetic analysis can reveal information that no other method can provide, DNA analysis has mapped family relationships with precision. The 2010 study of New Kingdom mummies identified Tutankhamun's parents, grandparents, and other relatives, creating a detailed family tree. It revealed the extent of inbreeding in the royal family and identified genetic disorders. Similar studies have traced family relationships in non-royal mummies, revealing information about ancient Egyptian family structures and marriage patterns. Genetic analysis has also revealed the geographic origins of ancient Egyptians. Studies have found that ancient Egyptians were genetically similar to other populations in the Near East and Mediterranean, with some genetic contribution from sub-Saharan Africa. The genetic makeup of the population changed over time, reflecting Egypt's position as a crossroads of trade and migration. These findings have helped resolve debates about the ethnic composition of ancient Egypt and the relationships between Egyptians and neighboring populations. Blood type can sometimes be determined from mummified tissue. Ramesses II was blood type B. Tutankhamun was type A. This information seems trivial, but it's a reminder that these were real people with the same biological characteristics we have. It humanizes them in a way that monuments and inscriptions cannot. Recent advances in imaging technology continue to reveal new information. In 2019, researchers used a technique called virtual endoscopy to examine the interior of mummies at a microscopic level, revealing details of tissue structure that weren't visible with standard CT scanning. Another technique called multi-energy CT can distinguish between different types of tissue and materials more clearly than conventional CT scans, making it easier to identify diseases and understand mummification techniques. Chemical analysis of mummified tissue has revealed information about diet. Isotope analysis of bone and hair can show what people ate and where they lived at different times in their lives. Studies have found that elite Egyptians ate more meat and fish than common people who relied heavily on bread and beer. Some mummies show evidence of nutritional deficiencies, particularly in childhood visible, as lines in the bones where growth was temporarily interrupted by malnutrition or illness. Even the wrappings themselves provide information. Analysis of the linen reveals weaving techniques and can sometimes identify the geographic origin of the flax used to make the cloth. Some wrappings were made from recycled household linens, and occasionally these contain laundry marks or other writing that provides unexpected information about daily life. The resins used in wrapping can be chemically analyzed to identify their sources, revealing trade networks and changes in mummification practices over time. What emerges from all these studies is a detailed picture of life and death in ancient Egypt that would have been impossible to obtain any other way. The mummies reveal that ancient Egyptians suffered from many of the same diseases we face today: heart disease, cancer, arthritis, dental problems. They show that violence and accidents were constant dangers. They demonstrate that ancient Egyptian medicine could treat some conditions successfully, but was helpless against others. They reveal the genetic consequences of royal inbreeding and the family relationships that shaped political history. Most importantly, these studies remind us that the ancient Egyptians were people, not abstractions. They felt pain from dental abscesses and arthritic joints. They suffered from parasitic infections and malaria. They broke bones and sometimes survived, sometimes didn't. They aged their arteries, hardened their teeth, wore down their joints, stiffened. The divine pharaohs presented in art as eternally youthful and perfect were in reality as vulnerable to disease and injury as anyone else. The mummies examined with modern technology strip away the idealized images and reveal the biological reality beneath, making the achievements of ancient Egypt somehow more impressive, accomplished by people who faced the same physical limitations and health challenges that humans have always faced. Ramesses the Great. In the spring of 1881, when the royal mummy cache at Deir el-Bahari was opened, archaeologists found themselves face to face with the greatest pharaoh of ancient Egypt. The mummy of Ramesses II lay in a simple wooden coffin, his body wrapped in linen that had been rewrapped in antiquity by priests trying to protect him from tomb robbers. When the bandages around his head were carefully loosened, they revealed a face that was remarkably well preserved. A long, narrow face with a prominent hooked nose, strong jaw, and wisps of white hair. This was the man who had ruled Egypt for 66 years, who had built more monuments than any other pharaoh, and whose name had become synonymous with Egyptian power and glory. Even in death, more than 3,000 years after his reign, Ramesses commanded attention. Ramesses II came to power around 1279 BCE, in his mid-20s, inheriting a stable and prosperous kingdom from his father, Seti I. Egypt was at the height of its new kingdom power, controlling territories from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. But this empire faced constant challenges. The Hittite Empire, based in Anatolia, modern Turkey, was expanding southward, threatening Egyptian interests in Syria and Canaan. Within 5 years of taking the throne, Ramesses would face the Hittites in what would become the defining moment of his reign, a battle that he would commemorate on monuments across Egypt for the rest of his life. The Battle of Kadesh took place around 274 BCE in what is now Syria, near the Orontes River. Ramesses led an army of approximately 20,000 men, divided into 4 divisions, named after Egyptian gods Amun-Ra, Ptah, and Seth. The Hittite king, Muwatalli II, commanded a force that may have been even larger, including troops from allied kingdoms throughout Anatolia and the Near East. The battle began disastrously for Egypt. Ramesses, leading the Amun division, was lured into a trap by false intelligence from captured Hittite spies who claimed the Hittite army was far away. In reality, the Hittites were hidden behind the city of Kadesh, and they launched a surprise attack on the Egyptian Ra division, routing it completely. Ramesses suddenly found himself cut off from most of his army, surrounded by Hittite chariots. According to his own account, carved on temple walls throughout Egypt, he called upon the god Amun for help, then single-handedly charged into the enemy, his bow raining arrows, his chariot crushing opponents beneath its wheels. He fought with superhuman courage, turning the tide of battle through personal valor. The other Egyptian divisions arrived, the Hittites were driven back, and Ramesses achieved a great victory. This is the version Ramesses wanted history to remember, and he made sure it was recorded everywhere. The battle account appears on the walls of temples at Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, Abu Simbel, and the Ramesseum. It's told in both prose and poetry, with vivid descriptions of Ramesses' heroism. The famous Poem of Pentar, which recounts the battle, presents Ramesses as a warrior of unmatched skill and courage, abandoned by his troops, but saved by his own prowess and divine favor. The Hittite records tell a different story. According to their accounts, the battle was essentially a draw. The Egyptians failed to capture Kadesh, which had been their objective. The Hittites failed to destroy the Egyptian army. Both sides claimed victory, and both sides likely suffered heavy casualties. The battle resolved nothing militarily, and skirmishes between Egypt and the Hittites continued for years afterward. But Ramesses understood something crucial. In the ancient world, as in the modern one, perception often mattered more than reality. By proclaiming a great victory and carving it in stone across Egypt, he created a narrative that served his political purposes regardless of what actually happened on the battlefield. 16 years after Kadesh, Ramesses and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed a peace treaty, one of the oldest surviving international agreements in history. Copies were made in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. The treaty established peace between the two empires, defined their mutual borders, and created a defensive alliance against common enemies. It was sealed by a diplomatic marriage. Ramesses married a Hittite princess, cementing the alliance. This treaty brought stability to the region and allowed Ramesses to focus on what he loved most, building. Ramesses too was the most prolific builder in Egyptian history. He constructed or significantly expanded temples across Egypt and Nubia. At Karnak, he added a massive hypostyle hall with 134 columns, some reaching 69 feet high and 12 feet in diameter. At Luxor, he added a new court and massive pylons, along with 6 colossal statues of himself and 2 obelisks. One still stands at Luxor, the other was given to France in 1829, and now stands in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. At Abydos, he completed his father's temple and built his own. At Memphis, he constructed a new palace and expanded the Temple of Ptah. But Ramesses' most spectacular monuments were built in Nubia, far to the south. At Abu Simbel, he carved 2 temples directly into a sandstone cliff face. The great temple features 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses at its entrance, each 67 feet tall, carved from the living rock. The statues show Ramesses wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, gazing out over the Nile. The temple was oriented so that twice a year, on February 27th and October 22nd, the rising sun would shine directly through the entrance and illuminate the sanctuary deep inside the mountain, lighting up statues of Ramesses and the gods. The smaller temple at Abu Simbel was dedicated to Ramesses' principal wife, Nefertari, and the goddess Hathor. Its facade features 6 standing colossal statues, 4 of Ramesses and 2 of Nefertari shone at equal size, an unusual honor for a queen. These monuments weren't just architecture, they were propaganda. Every surface was covered with inscriptions and reliefs celebrating Ramesses's achievements, particularly his victory at Kadesh. His names and titles appeared everywhere, often carved so deeply that they couldn't easily be erased by later rulers. In some cases, Ramesses simply usurped monuments built by earlier pharaohs, having his name carved over theirs. This practice, while not unique to Ramesses, was one he employed extensively. Many statues and buildings attributed to Ramesses were actually created by his predecessors, with his cartouches added later. Ramesses also built a new capital city in the Nile Delta, which he called Pi-Ramesses, House of Ramesses. The city was strategically located near Egypt's northeastern border, allowing the pharaoh to respond quickly to threats from Asia. It featured palaces, temples, military barracks, and workshops. The city was described in ancient texts as a place of great beauty and wealth, with gardens, lakes, and magnificent buildings. Unfortunately, the Nile shifted course in later centuries, and the city was gradually abandoned. Its stones were reused in other construction projects, and today, little remains of Pi-Ramesses above ground, though archaeological surveys have mapped its layout. Ramesses's family was as extensive as his building projects. He had multiple wives, with Nefertari and Esetnofret being the most prominent in the early part of his reign. Nefertari was clearly his favorite, at least initially. He built the smaller temple at Abu Simbel for her, and her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is one of the most beautifully decorated in Egypt. After her death around year 25 of his reign, other wives became more prominent, including several of his own daughters, whom he married in keeping with royal tradition. Ramesses fathered an extraordinary number of children. Ancient texts mention more than 100 sons and daughters, though the exact number is uncertain. He outlived many of them. His 13th son, Merneptah, eventually succeeded him, becoming pharaoh in his 60s, because all his older brothers had died before their father. This vast family created a network of royal relatives who filled important positions throughout the government and priesthood, strengthening Ramesses's control over Egypt. The king's longevity was itself remarkable. In an era when life expectancy was perhaps 40 years, Ramesses lived into his 90s, ruling for 66 years. By the end of his reign, few Egyptians could remember any other pharaoh. He had become an institution, almost immortal in his subjects' eyes. His later years were marked by declining health. His mummy shows that he suffered from severe arthritis, particularly in the hips and spine. His teeth were badly worn and abscessed. He had hardened arteries. He was bent with age, and walking must have been painful. Yet he continued to rule, continued to build, and continued to present himself as Egypt's divine protector. When Ramesses died, probably in 1213 BCE, he was buried in a massive tomb in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV7. The tomb was one of the largest ever constructed in the valley, with multiple corridors and chambers extending deep into the bedrock. Unfortunately, the tomb's location made it vulnerable to flooding, and over the centuries, water damage destroyed much of its decoration and structure. The tomb was robbed in antiquity, and Ramesses' mummy was moved by priests to the cache at Deir el-Bahari, where it remained hidden for nearly 3,000 years. When Ramesses's mummy was examined in modern times, it revealed a man who had been tall for his era, about 5 feet 7 inches, with red hair, likely dyed with henna in old age. His face showed the prominent nose and strong features visible in his statues. The mummification had been done with great care, and the body was remarkably well preserved, though it showed signs of the hasty rewrapping done by ancient priests when they moved it to the cache. In 1976, the mummy was flown to Paris for conservation treatment. French scientists were concerned about fungal growth on the mummy and wanted to treat it with gamma radiation. The mummy was issued a passport listing his occupation as king deceased, and was received at the airport with full military honors due to a head of state. The conservation was successful, and Ramesses returned to Egypt, where his mummy now rests in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo. Ramesses II's legacy is complex. He was undoubtedly one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs, ruling during a period of prosperity and stability. His building projects were magnificent, and many still stand today, testifying to the skill of Egyptian architects and craftsmen. His diplomatic achievements, particularly the peace treaty with the Hittites, brought decades of stability to the region. He created a vast family network that strengthened royal power and left a dynasty that would rule Egypt for generations. But his legacy also includes propaganda and self-aggrandizement on a scale rarely matched in history. He exaggerated his military victories, usurped his predecessors' monuments, and covered Egypt with his names and images to an extent that some scholars consider excessive, even by pharaonic standards. He was a master of what we might call public relations, understanding that controlling the narrative, carving it literally in stone, could shape how history remembered him. And it worked. More than 3,000 years after his death, Ramesses II remains the most famous pharaoh of ancient Egypt, with the possible exception of Tutankhamun. His monuments are among Egypt's most visited tourist sites. His name is instantly recognizable. He achieved exactly what he intended: immortality through stone and inscription, his name spoken by generation after generation, his face known across the world. Whether this makes him great in the moral sense is debatable, but in terms of achieving lasting fame and leaving an indelible mark on history, Ramesses the Great certainly lived up to his name. The Royal Mummy Cache. In the late 1870s, antiquities dealers in Luxor began offering objects for sale that troubled Gaston Maspero, the French director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. These weren't ordinary artifacts. They were items of unmistakably royal quality funerary papyri, bearing the names of pharaohs, jewelry with royal cartouches, and shabti figures inscribed with the titles of kings and queens. Such objects could only have come from royal tombs, yet all the known royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings had been discovered and cleared centuries ago. Either someone had found a new royal tomb, or they had access to a cache of royal burial equipment that had somehow remained hidden. Maspero was determined to find the source. The investigation led to a family living near the Valley of the Kings, the Abd el-Rasul brothers, who came from a long line of the locals who knew the ancient burial grounds intimately. The family had a reputation, though nothing could be proven. When questioned by authorities, the brothers denied any knowledge of illegal antiquities. They were arrested and interrogated, but they maintained their innocence. Without concrete evidence, the authorities had to release them. The flow of royal artifacts onto the market continued, but the source remained mysterious. Then in the spring of 1881, family dynamics changed everything. One of the brothers, Mohammed Abd el-Rasul, apparently motivated by a dispute over the division of profits, and perhaps hoping to claim a reward, went to the authorities and revealed the family secret. 6 years earlier, in 1875, his brother Ahmed had been searching the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari on the west bank of the Nile, across from Luxor, when he discovered a hidden shaft tomb. What Ahmed found inside was extraordinary. Not a single royal burial, but dozens of mummies, including some of Egypt's most famous pharaohs, hidden away in antiquity by priests trying to protect them from tomb robbers. On July 6, 1881, Emil Brugsch, Maspero's assistant, accompanied Mohammed Abd el-Rasul to the site. They climbed the steep path up the cliff face to a location about 200 feet above the valley floor. There, concealed among the rocks, was a shaft approximately 40 feet deep and 6 feet square. Brugsch descended into the darkness using a rope. At the bottom, he found himself in a corridor that extended into the cliff with a chamber opening off to one side and the corridor continuing beyond. What Brugsch saw in the flickering light of his candle must have been overwhelming. The corridor and chamber were filled with coffins, some stacked on top of others, some leaning against the walls. Many bore royal names and titles. As Brugsch explored further, the magnitude of the discovery became clear. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a hiding place where ancient priests had gathered royal mummies from across the Theban necropolis, attempting to protect them from the tomb robbers who had plagued the area since ancient times. The cache contained approximately 50 mummies, including some of the most illustrious names in Egyptian history. There was Seqenenretau, a pharaoh of the 17th dynasty, whose mummy bore terrible head wounds from the battle that had killed him. There was Ahmose, founder of the 18th dynasty, and the new kingdom, the pharaoh who had expelled the Hyksos invaders and reunited Egypt. There was Amenhotep, whose mummy was so well preserved that later generations had worshipped him as a patron saint of the Theban necropolis. There was Thutmose, Thutmose, and Thutmose III, the latter being the great warrior pharaoh who had expanded Egypt's empire to its greatest extent. And there was Ramesses II, the great builder whose monuments covered Egypt, now lying in a simple wooden coffin in a hidden shaft far from the magnificent tomb he had prepared for himself in the Valley of the Kings. His mummy was accompanied by those of his father, Seti-Thofmer, whose mummy was one of the most beautifully preserved in the cache, and his son, Ramesses III. There were queens as well, including Amos Nefertari, wife of Amos, and several royal wives and daughters from the 18th and 19th dynasties. The coffins bore hieratic inscriptions, a cursive form of hieroglyphic writing that told the story of how these mummies came to be here. The inscriptions recorded dates and the names of the priests who had moved the mummies. The earliest inscriptions dated to the late 20th dynasty and the 21st dynasty around 1000 BCE, a period when tomb robbery had become rampant in the Theban necropolis. The priests of Amun responsible for maintaining the royal burials had faced an impossible situation. Despite guards and official oversight, tombs were being broken into and plundered. The robbers were often caught and prosecuted. Papyri from this period record tomb robbery trials with detailed confessions, but the robberies continued. The priests made a desperate decision. They would move the royal mummies to secret locations, rewrap them, place them in simple coffins, and hide them away. The inscriptions recorded this process. Year 10, third month of winter, day 20. On this day, the renewal of burial of King Amenhotep I by the high priest of Amun-Pinegem II. Similar inscriptions appeared on other coffins documenting the dates when various mummies were moved and rewrapped. Some mummies had been moved multiple times as successive hiding places were compromised or deemed inadequate. The shaft at Deir el-Bahari appears to have been the final hiding place where mummies from various locations were gathered together. The priests had chosen the location carefully. It was in a remote area of the cliffs difficult to access, and the shaft entrance was small and easily concealed. Once the mummies were placed inside and the shaft was filled with rubble and sealed, it would have been nearly invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The Abd el-Rasul family had kept their discovery secret for 6 years, carefully removing objects that could be sold without attracting too much attention. They had been selective, taking smaller items, papyri jewelry, shabti figures, while leaving the mummies and coffins largely intact. This restraint, whether motivated by superstition, practicality, or some respect for the dead, meant that when the cache was officially discovered, it remained substantially complete. Brugsch faced an immediate problem. The cache needed to be secured and the contents moved to Cairo for study and preservation. But the location was remote accessible only by a difficult climb, and the local population, many of whom were related to the Abd el-Rasul family, might not be pleased about losing the source of antiquities. Brugsch made a bold decision. He would clear the entire cache immediately, within days, before word could spread, and before anyone could interfere. Over the next 48 hours working in the July heat, Brugsch supervised the removal of all the mummies and coffins from the shaft. Local workers were hired to carry the mummies down the steep cliff path and across the desert to the Nile. The coffins were wrapped in mats and ropes and hauled up the shaft, then carried to the river. It was exhausting, dangerous work in brutal conditions. Some of the coffins were heavy and awkward, requiring multiple men to carry them. The path was treacherous, and one misstep could send a priceless mummy tumbling down the cliff. By July 11th, just 5 days after the discovery, all the mummies had been transported to the riverbank and loaded onto a boat for the journey to Cairo. According to some accounts, as the boat carrying the ancient kings sailed down the Nile, villagers along the banks came out to watch. Women wailed in mourning and men fired rifles into the air, traditional gestures of respect for the dead. Whether this actually happened as described or has been embellished in the retelling is uncertain, but it makes for a powerful image, the ancient pharaohs making one final journey down the Nile, mourned by the descendants of the people they had once ruled. In Cairo, the mummies were taken to the Egyptian Museum, where Maspero and his team could begin the careful work of unwrapping, examining, and cataloging them. The process took years. Each mummy had to be carefully documented, photographed, and studied. The wrappings contained valuable information about rewrapping techniques and the inscriptions that recorded the mummies' movements in antiquity. The bodies themselves provided information about the health age and sometimes the cause of death of these ancient rulers. The discovery of the cache solved a mystery that had puzzled Egyptologists for decades. Where were all the royal mummies? The tombs in the Valley of the Kings had been found empty or containing only fragments. Now the answer was clear. The mummies had been moved in antiquity, hidden away by priests who were trying to protect them. The cache at Deir el-Bahari wasn't the only one. In 1898, another cache was discovered in the tomb of Amenhotep II, KV35, containing 13 mummies, including several pharaohs. But the 1881 cache remained the largest and most significant. The discovery also revealed something important about ancient Egyptian attitudes toward their ancestors. The priests who moved these mummies weren't tomb robbers. They removed the valuable grave goods, the gold jewelry, and precious objects that attracted thieves, and likely used these resources to fund the temple and maintain religious services. But they treated the mummies themselves with reverence, carefully rewrapping them, recording their identities, and placing them in secure locations. The bodies of the pharaohs were sacred vessels that needed to be preserved for the afterlife. Even when the tombs could no longer be protected, even when the treasures had to be removed, the mummies themselves were safeguarded. This practice continued for generations. The inscriptions on the coffins show that the rewrapping and moving of mummies spanned several reigns, with different high priests taking responsibility for protecting their ancestors. It was a losing battle. The economic and political chaos of the late New Kingdom made it impossible to maintain the old standards of tomb security, but the priests did what they could. They saved the mummies, even if they couldn't save the treasures. The Abd el-Rasul family's discovery and their 6 years of secret exploitation raise ethical questions that remain relevant today. They had found an archaeological treasure of immense importance and had kept it secret, removing objects for profit. Yet their restraint in not destroying the cache entirely, and Muhammad's eventual decision to reveal it, meant that the mummies were preserved and could be studied. The family received a reward and were even hired as foremen for future archaeological excavations in the area, their intimate knowledge of the necropolis proving valuable to researchers. Today, many of the mummies from the cache are on display in Cairo, their faces visible to visitors who come to see the actual bodies of pharaohs whose names they know from history books. Ramesses II, Seti, Pharaoh, Thutmose III, and others lie in climate-controlled cases, their preserved features still recognizable after more than 3,000 years. They survived tomb robbers in antiquity, survived being moved and hidden by priests, survived 6 years of secret exploitation by the Abd el-Rasul family, and survived the hasty evacuation from their hiding place. Now they rest in a museum, protected at last, their long journey from royal tomb to secret cache, to public display finally complete. The priests who hid them would probably be satisfied with this outcome. The mummies are preserved, protected, and honored, even if the circumstances are nothing like what those ancient priests could have imagined. The Valley of Kings. Around 1500 BCE, the pharaohs of Egypt made a decision that would define royal burial practices for the next 500 years. They abandoned the tradition of building pyramids monuments that had served as royal tombs for over 1,000 years and chose instead a remote desert valley on the west bank of the Nile across from the ancient city of Thebes. This barren wadi, hemmed in by steep limestone cliffs and dominated by a pyramid-shaped mountain peak, would become known as the Valley of the Kings. Here, in tombs carved deep into the bedrock and hidden from view, the pharaohs of the new kingdom would be buried surrounded by treasures meant to sustain them in the afterlife. It was an attempt to protect royal burials from the tomb robbers who had plundered the pyramids. The attempt would largely fail, but the valley would become one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. The decision to move royal burials to this location was both practical and symbolic. The pyramid-shaped peak that looms over the valley, called El Qurn, the Horn, by local Arabs, created a natural pyramid. Every tomb in the valley lay beneath this peak, giving each burial a symbolic pyramid without the need to construct one. The location was also more defensible than the open desert where the pyramid stood. The valley had only one main entrance, making it easier to guard. The limestone cliffs concealed the tomb entrances, which could be hidden and sealed after burial. And the remote location, far from settlements and agricultural land, meant fewer people would pass by and potentially discover the tombs. The first pharaoh to be buried in the valley was probably Thutmose I, around 1500 BCE, though some scholars argue that his predecessor Amenhotep I may have been first. Thutmose I's architect Inanna left an inscription describing the work. "I supervised the excavation of the cliff tomb of His Majesty, alone no one seeing, no one hearing." This secrecy would become a hallmark of royal burials in the valley. The fewer people who knew the exact location of a tomb, the better its chances of remaining undisturbed. Over the next 5 centuries, more than 60 tombs were carved into the valley's cliffs. Not all were for pharaohs. Some belonged to queens, princes, and high officials who were granted the honor of burial near their kings. The tombs varied greatly in size and complexity, reflecting both the wealth of individual pharaohs and the length of their reigns. A pharaoh who ruled for decades could commission an elaborate tomb with multiple chambers, long corridor, and extensive decoration. A pharaoh who died young might be buried in a smaller, hastily prepared tomb. The construction of these tombs was an enormous undertaking. Workers had to cut through solid limestone, sometimes extending corridor and chambers hundreds of feet into the bedrock. The tomb of Seti I, one of the longest in the valley, extends approximately 450 feet into the cliff and descends to a depth of about 100 feet below the entrance. The workers used copper and bronze tools, chisels, hammers, and picks to cut the stone. They worked by the light of oil lamps, which left soot marks on the ceilings that are still visible today. The stone chips and rubble were carried out in baskets and dumped in piles outside the tomb or in the valley. The workers who built these tombs lived in a special village called Deir el-Medina, located in a small valley about a mile from the Valley of the Kings. This wasn't an ordinary village. Its inhabitants were skilled craftsmen, stonecutters, plasterers, painters, and scribes who worked exclusively on royal tombs. They were well paid for their specialized labor and their discretion. The village was isolated, surrounded by walls with guards controlling access. The workers lived there, with their families, creating a community that lasted for generations. We know a great deal about their lives because they left behind thousands of ostraca limestone flakes and pottery sherds used as writing surfaces, recording everything from work assignments and wages to personal letters and legal disputes. The tomb workers operated in crews typically working 8-hour shifts. They had a 10-day work week with the 10th day off. During their work periods, they stayed in temporary shelters near the valley rather than returning to the village each day. The work was organized hierarchically, with foremen overseeing teams of workers. The entire operation was supervised by royal officials who reported to the vizier, the pharaoh's chief administrator. Records show that workers sometimes went on strike when their wages paid in grain beer and other goods were delayed, demonstrating that even in ancient Egypt, labor relations could be contentious. Once the tomb was excavated, artists took over. The walls were plastered smooth, then covered with elaborate paintings and carved reliefs. These weren't merely decorative. The images and texts served a religious purpose, guiding the deceased pharaoh through the dangers of the underworld and ensuring his successful rebirth in the afterlife. The walls were covered with scenes from funerary texts, the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, the Book of Gates, and others, each depicting the 12 hours of the night that the sun god Ra traveled through the underworld, battling demons and obstacles before being reborn at dawn. The tombs followed a general pattern, though with variations. A stairway or sloping corridor led down from the entrance, often with multiple descending passages and chambers. There were usually false chambers or blocked passages designed to confuse tomb robbers. The corridors eventually led to the burial chamber where the pharaoh's sarcophagus would be placed. This chamber was the most elaborately decorated, with the ceiling often painted to represent the night sky, complete with stars and constellations. Side chambers held grave goods, furniture, clothing, jewelry, food, wine, and everything the pharaoh might need in the afterlife. Despite all these precautions, the remote location, the hidden entrances, the guards, the secrecy, nearly every tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed in antiquity. Many were plundered within years or even months of the burial. Papyri from the late 20th dynasty, around 1100 BCE, record tomb robbery, trials with detailed confessions. The robbers described tunneling into tombs, stripping mummies of their gold and jewelry, and melting down precious objects to hide the evidence. The punishments were severe. Death by impalement was common, but the potential rewards were enormous, and the robberies continued. The robbers were often people with inside knowledge. Some were the very workers who had built the tombs. Others were guards who were supposed to protect them. Some robberies were organized by corrupt officials who took a share of the loot. The tomb of Tutankhamun, which escaped major plundering, shows evidence of 2 ancient break-ins, both apparently discovered quickly and resealed by officials. Most tombs weren't so fortunate. By the end of the New Kingdom around 1070 BCE, the situation had become so bad that priests began moving royal mummies to hidden caches, as we've seen, removing the remaining treasures and trying to protect at least the bodies of the pharaohs. The valley was gradually abandoned as a royal burial ground. Later dynasties buried their pharaohs elsewhere, often in the Nile Delta in northern Egypt. The Valley of the Kings became a tourist attraction, even in ancient times. Greek and Roman visitors carved graffiti on tomb walls, and some tombs remained accessible throughout antiquity and the medieval period. But many tombs were lost, their entrances buried by debris from flash floods or covered by rubble from later construction. The systematic exploration of the valley began in the 18th and 19th centuries. European adventurers and archaeologists drawn by the romance of ancient Egypt, began searching for tombs. Giovanni Belzoni, an Italian strongman turned archaeologist, discovered several important tombs in the early 1800s, including that of Seti I. Throughout the 19th century, more tombs were found and cleared, though often with methods that would horrify modern archaeologists. Artifacts were removed with little documentation, and tombs were damaged in the rush to find treasures. By the early 20th century, most Egyptologists believed the valley had been thoroughly explored. Every accessible tomb had been found and cleared. When Theodore Davis, an American lawyer who funded excavations in the valley, gave up his concession in 1914, he declared, "I fear that the Valley of the Tombs is now exhausted." Howard Carter disagreed. He believed one tomb remained undiscovered, that of Tutankhamun. His persistence would be vindicated in 1922, proving that even in a valley that had been searched for centuries, secrets could still be hidden beneath the sand. Today, the Valley of the Kings is one of Egypt's most visited tourist sites. Visitors descend into tombs that were meant to be sealed forever, walking corridors that pharaohs believed would lead them to the afterlife. The paintings on the walls created more than 3,000 years ago remain vibrant in many tombs protected by the dry desert climate. Modern conservation efforts work to preserve these tombs from the damage caused by humidity from visitors' breath dust and the inevitable deterioration of ancient materials. The valley continues to yield discoveries. In 2005, a team led by Otto Schaden discovered a new tomb, KV-63, containing storage jars and mummification materials. In 2008, radar surveys suggested there might be undiscovered chambers in the valley. Archaeological work continues with new technologies like ground-penetrating radar and 3D mapping, revealing features that weren't visible to earlier explorers. What the Valley of the Kings represents is both the height of Egyptian funerary ambition and a testament to human nature. The pharaohs tried to protect their burials through secrecy, remote location, and elaborate security measures. They filled their tombs with treasures meant to last for eternity. They covered the walls with magical texts designed to ensure their safe passage to the afterlife. Yet within generations, most of the tombs were robbed, the treasures stolen, and melted down, the mummies disturbed or destroyed. The beautiful artwork survived, but only because it couldn't be easily carried away and sold. The valley reminds us that no amount of wealth or power can truly protect against time and human greed. The pharaohs who built these tombs were among the most powerful rulers in the ancient world, commanding vast resources and absolute authority. Yet they couldn't prevent their own tombs from being plundered. The treasures they accumulated for the afterlife enriched tomb robbers instead. Only the tombs themselves remain empty chambers, decorated with images of a journey to an afterlife that, as far as we can tell, no pharaoh ever reached. The Valley of the Kings stands as a monument to both human ambition and human futility, a place where the dreams of immortality carved in stone outlasted the treasures meant to make those dreams real. DNA and Dynasty. In February 2010, a team of Egyptian and international researchers published the results of a study that had taken more than 2 years to complete. Using DNA extracted from 11 royal mummies, they had mapped 5 generations of the 18th dynasty with scientific precision, creating a family tree that resolved some historical mysteries while raising new questions. The study represented a breakthrough in our understanding of ancient Egyptian royal genealogy, but it also revealed something darker: the genetic consequences of a practice that Egyptian royal families had followed for centuries. Marriage between close relatives, often siblings, to keep the bloodline pure and consolidate power. The extraction of usable DNA from ancient mummies is extraordinarily difficult. DNA degrades over time, breaking into smaller and smaller fragments. The hot, dry conditions that preserve mummified tissue also damage DNA. Contamination is a constant concern. Modern DNA from researchers, museum workers, or even tourists who have viewed the mummies can overwhelm the small amounts of ancient DNA present in the samples. For these reasons, ancient DNA studies require extreme precautions and multiple samples to verify results. The 2010 study led by Dr. Zahi Hawass and Dr. Karsten Pusch focused on mummies from the late 18th dynasty, particularly those related to Tutankhamun. The researchers took samples from bone tissue, which preserves DNA better than soft tissue. They worked in specially designed clean rooms to prevent contamination. They extracted DNA from multiple samples from each mummy and repeated their analyses several times to ensure accuracy. They also extracted DNA from the researchers themselves, creating a database of modern DNA that might contaminate the samples, allowing them to identify and exclude any contamination. The results were illuminating. The study confirmed that the mummy known as KV-5, found in a small tomb near Tutankhamun's, was indeed Tutankhamun's father. This mummy is almost certainly Akhenaten, though the identification isn't absolutely certain, because the name was deliberately erased from the coffin in antiquity. The DNA showed that KV-5 was the son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, whose mummies were also tested. This confirmed the historical record and established Akhenaten's parentage with scientific certainty. The study also identified Tutankhamun's mother. She was the mummy known as the Younger Lady, found in tomb KV-35, along with several other royal mummies. The DNA analysis revealed that she was a full sister of the KV-55 mummy, meaning Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, both children of Amenhotep III and Tiye. This wasn't entirely surprising to historians, as sibling marriage was practiced in the Egyptian royal family, but having genetic confirmation was significant. The implications of this finding were profound. Tutankhamun was the product of incest, and not just any incest, but between full siblings who were themselves the children of a royal marriage that may have involved close relatives. The genetic consequences were visible in Tutankhamun's remains. The DNA analysis detected markers for several inherited conditions, including Kolar disease, which causes bone necrosis in the foot, explaining the bone death visible in CT scans of Tutankhamun's left foot. The study also found genetic markers suggesting a predisposition to immune system problems. The researchers tested 2 mummified fetuses found in Tutankhamun's tomb, both female. DNA analysis confirmed they were his daughters, almost certainly stillborn or dying shortly after birth. One fetus was about 5 months gestation, the other about 9 months. The genetic analysis showed that these infants had inherited disorders from both parents, compounding the effects of inbreeding. Tutankhamun's wife was his half-sister, Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The marriage between half-siblings following a generation where full siblings had married created a genetic bottleneck that likely contributed to the infants' deaths. This pattern of close intermarriage wasn't unique to Tutankhamun's family. Egyptian royal families had practiced sibling marriage for centuries, based on both religious and political reasoning. The mythological precedent was set by the gods. Osiris had married his sister Isis, and their son Horus was a model for every pharaoh. Marrying within the family kept the royal bloodline pure, prevented the dilution of divine blood with that of commoners, and avoided creating rival power centers through marriages to non-royal families. It also consolidated wealth and power within the royal family, but the genetic costs accumulated over generations. When close relatives reproduce, there's an increased chance that harmful recessive genes will be expressed. Everyone carries some genetic mutations that could cause problems if inherited from both parents. In most populations, the chance of 2 parents carrying the same harmful mutation is relatively low because they're not closely related. But when siblings or other close relatives have children, the probability increases dramatically. The child may inherit the same harmful mutation from both parents, resulting in genetic disorders. The DNA study found evidence of this throughout the 18th dynasty royal family. Multiple mummies showed signs of genetic disorders that were likely the result of inbreeding. The accumulation of these disorders over generations weakened the royal line. This may help explain why the 18th dynasty ended with Tutankhamun's death. There were no healthy male heirs to continue the line. The dynasty that had produced some of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs, including Thutmose III and Amenhotep III, ended with a sickly teenager who died without surviving children. The 2010 study also addressed the question of what killed Tutankhamun. The DNA analysis detected the presence of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite that causes the most severe form of malaria. The parasite's DNA was found in multiple samples from Tutankhamun's mummy, confirming that he was infected with malaria at or near the time of death. Combined with the evidence of the leg fracture visible in CT scans, this suggested a likely scenario. Tutankhamun, already weakened by genetic disorders, and malaria, suffered a severe leg injury that became infected, leading to sepsis and death. The study's findings extended beyond Tutankhamun's immediate family. By analyzing DNA from multiple royal mummies, the researchers were able to map family relationships across several generations. They confirmed that Amenhotep III and Queen Taye were Akhenaten's parents. They identified the mummy known as the Elder Lady from KV-35 as Queen Taye herself, resolving a debate that had lasted for decades. They established relationships between various mummies that had been uncertain based on historical records alone. However, the study also had limitations and raised new questions. The researchers couldn't definitively identify Tutankhamun's mother by name. The younger lady mummy remains anonymous. They couldn't determine whether Nefertiti was Tutankhamun's mother, as some theories suggested, because Nefertiti's mummy hasn't been definitively identified. The study also couldn't resolve all the genealogical questions about the Amarna period, which remains one of the most confusing periods in Egyptian history due to the deliberate erasure of records after Akhenaten's death. DNA analysis has continued beyond the 2010 study. Researchers have analyzed other royal mummies, gradually building a more complete picture of Egyptian royal genealogy. A 2012 study examined mummies from the 20th dynasty, including Ramesses III, and found genetic evidence that he was indeed related to earlier Ramesside pharaohs, confirming the historical record. The same study detected DNA from the malaria parasite in several mummies, suggesting the disease was widespread in ancient Egypt. More recent studies have looked at the broader Egyptian population, not just royals. DNA extracted from mummies of common people has revealed information about ancient Egyptian ancestry and how the population changed over time. These studies have found that ancient Egyptians were genetically similar to populations in the Near East and Mediterranean, with some genetic contribution from sub-Saharan Africa. The genetic makeup of the population shifted over Egypt's long history, reflecting migrations, invasions, and trade contacts. The technology for extracting and analyzing ancient DNA continues to improve. Newer techniques can work with smaller, more degraded DNA samples. Better methods for preventing and detecting contamination have made results more reliable. As technology advances, researchers hope to analyze more mummies and answer questions that remain unresolved. One significant finding from genetic studies is that the royal family's practice of inbreeding was not typical of the broader Egyptian population. DNA from non-royal mummies shows much more genetic diversity, indicating that common Egyptians generally married outside their immediate families. The genetic problems visible in royal mummies were largely confined to the royal family, a consequence of their unique marriage practices. This raises an interesting question. did the ancient Egyptians understand the risks of inbreeding? They certainly observed that children of sibling marriages sometimes had health problems, but they may not have connected this to genetics, a concept they couldn't have understood. They may have attributed health problems to other causes, divine displeasure, magical curses, or simple bad luck. The religious and political benefits of sibling marriage apparently outweighed any concerns about health consequences. The genetic evidence also sheds light on the end of dynasties. The 18th dynasty ended without a clear heir, leading to a period of instability before the 19th dynasty began. The 20th dynasty also ended in confusion with multiple short-lived pharaohs and disputed successions. Genetic disorders from inbreeding may have contributed to these dynastic crises by producing pharaohs who died young or without healthy heirs. Modern genetic analysis has transformed our understanding of ancient Egyptian royal families, turning genealogical puzzles into scientific questions that can be answered with DNA evidence. The family trees that historians constructed from inscriptions and texts can now be verified or corrected using genetic data. Relationships that were uncertain or disputed can be established definitively. And the health problems that affected individual pharaohs can be understood in the context of inherited genetic disorders. But the genetic studies also reveal something more fundamental about the ancient Egyptian royal family. Behind the divine imagery, the golden masks and the monumental architecture were real people with real biological vulnerabilities. The pharaohs presented themselves as gods, perfect and eternal, but their DNA tells a different story of genetic disorders accumulated through generations of inbreeding, of inherited diseases that caused pain and disability, of stillborn children who never had a chance at life. The double helix of DNA, invisible to the ancient Egyptians, but preserved in their mummified remains, has become a historical document as important as any papyrus revealing secrets that the pharaohs themselves never knew they were keeping. The female pharaohs. In the ancient Egyptian language, there was no word that specifically meant queen regnant, a woman ruling as pharaoh in her own right. The title pharaoh itself was grammatically masculine, as were all the royal titles and epithets. When women did rule Egypt, which happened rarely over 3,000 years of pharaonic history, they had to adapt masculine titles and imagery to fit their circumstances. They wore the false beard of kingship, adopted masculine grammatical forms in their inscriptions, and presented themselves in art with the regalia and posture of male pharaohs. Yet despite these adaptations, or perhaps because of them, the reigns of female pharaohs were often erased from later king lists, their monuments defaced and their names deliberately forgotten. The most successful of these female rulers was Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt for more than 20 years during the 18th dynasty, presiding over a period of peace and prosperity that rivaled any pharaoh's reign. Yet within decades of her death, someone systematically attempted to erase her from history. Hatshepsut came to power around 1479 BCE under circumstances that were not unusual for Egyptian royal women. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and the principal wife of her half-brother Thutmose II. This sibling marriage was standard practice for the royal family. When Thutmose II died after a relatively short reign, his son by a secondary wife Thutmose III was still a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. Hatshepsut became regent, ruling on behalf of her young stepson until he was old enough to rule independently. This too was not unusual. Royal women had served as regents before when pharaohs died leaving young heirs. But within a few years, something unprecedented happened. Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh, taking on the full royal titulary, the 5 names and titles that identified an Egyptian king. She didn't depose Thutmose III or claim he was illegitimate. Instead, she presented herself as co-regent, ruling alongside him. In temple reliefs and inscriptions, both appear as pharaohs, both wearing the crowns of kingship, both performing royal rituals. But there's no question who held real power. Hatshepsut's names and images dominate the monuments from this period, while Thutmose III, though acknowledged as co-ruler, remained in the background. Hatshepsut's assumption of full pharaonic power required justification. She couldn't simply declare herself pharaoh, she needed to establish her legitimacy in terms that Egyptian religious and political thought could accept. Her solution was brilliant. She claimed that she was the intended heir of her father Thutmose, chosen by him to rule Egypt. She commissioned reliefs showing Thutmose, proclaiming her as his successor before the royal court. Whether this actually happened is doubtful. If Thutmose had truly intended his daughter to rule, he would have made provisions during his lifetime. But the claim served its purpose, providing a narrative that explained and legitimized her rule. She went further, claiming divine birth. In reliefs at her temple at Deir el-Bahari, she depicted the god Amun visiting her mother, Queen Ahmose, in the form of Thutmose I, and fathering Hatshepsut. This divine conception made her not just a pharaoh but a god's daughter, with a divine right to rule that superseded normal succession rules. Male pharaohs made similar claims of divine parentage, but for a female ruler, such claims were even more important, providing religious justification for her unprecedented position. In official art, Hatshepsut presented herself with carefully calibrated imagery. In some reliefs, she appears in female form wearing a queen's dress and crown. In others, particularly in the later years of her reign, she's depicted with a male body, wearing the pharaoh's kilt and crown with the false beard of kingship attached to her chin. This wasn't an attempt to hide her gender. Inscriptions continued to use feminine grammatical forms when referring to her, and everyone knew she was a woman. Rather, it was an adaptation of the visual language of kingship to accommodate a female ruler. The pharaoh was a role and office with specific iconography and symbolism, and Hatshepsut adopted that iconography while maintaining her identity as a woman. Hatshepsut's reign was remarkably successful. She focused on trade diplomacy and building projects rather than military campaigns. The most famous achievement of her reign was a trading expedition to the land of Punt, a region probably located in modern Somalia or Eritrea. The expedition, depicted in detailed reliefs at Deir el-Bahari, brought back myrrh trees, gold ivory, ebony, and exotic animals. The reliefs show the ships being loaded, the journey to Punt, the meeting with Punt's rulers, and the triumphant return to Egypt. The myrrh trees were planted at Hatshepsut's temple, creating gardens that would produce incense for temple rituals. Her building projects were extensive and magnificent. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, designed by her architect Senenmut, is one of ancient Egypt's architectural masterpieces. Built into the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile, the temple rises in 3 colonnaded terraces, connected by ramps, its clean lines and elegant proportions creating a structure that still impresses visitors today. The temple walls were covered with reliefs depicting Hatshepsut's achievements: her divine birth, her coronation, the Punt expedition, and her building projects. Senenmut himself is an intriguing figure. He rose from relatively modest origins to become one of the most powerful officials in Egypt, holding numerous titles and overseeing Hatshepsut's building projects. Some scholars have speculated about a romantic relationship between Hatshepsut and Senenmut, though there's no direct evidence for this. What's clear is that Senenmut enjoyed unprecedented favor, even being granted the honor of a tomb near Hatshepsut's temple, an extraordinary privilege for a non-royal official. Hatshepsut ruled for approximately 22 years, dying around 1458 BCE, probably in her 50s. The cause of her death remained mysterious until 2007, when DNA analysis identified her mummy among several unidentified royal women in the Cairo Museum. The mummy showed she was obese, diabetic, and had suffered from bone cancer, which likely killed her. She also had severe dental disease, with abscesses that would have caused chronic pain. Analysis of a small box inscribed with her name found in the cache at Deir el-Bahari revealed that it contained a tooth, her tooth apparently removed during her lifetime, perhaps to relieve an abscess. The DNA from this tooth matched the mummy, confirming the identification. After Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III ruled alone for another 33 years, becoming one of Egypt's greatest warrior pharaohs and expanding the empire to its maximum extent. For the first 20 years or so of his sole reign, Hatshepsut's monuments remained intact. Then around year 42 of his reign, counting from when he first became co-ruler with Hatshepsut, someone ordered the systematic erasure of Hatshepsut's names and images from monuments throughout Egypt. The erasure was thorough and deliberate. Hatshepsut's cartouches were chiseled out and replaced with those of Thutmose, Bordenote, Thutmose II, or Thutmose III. Her images were removed from reliefs, leaving blank spaces, or replaced with images of Thutmose III. Her statues were smashed and buried. At Deir el-Bahari, her beautiful reliefs were defaced, her figure carefully chiseled away, while surrounding figures and hieroglyphs were left intact. This wasn't random vandalism, it was a calculated attempt to remove her from the historical record. Who ordered this erasure and why? The timing suggests it was Thutmose III, late in his reign. But his motivation remains debated. Some scholars argue it was personal revenge. Thutmose III resented being sidelined during Hatshepsut's reign and wanted to erase her memory. Others suggest it was political by removing Hatshepsut from the king lists. Thutmose III could present an unbroken succession, from his father through himself to his son, eliminating the problematic female reign that disrupted the normal pattern of male succession. Still others propose it was ideological. Hatshepsut's successful reign as a female pharaoh created a dangerous precedent that needed to be erased to prevent future challenges to male rule. The erasure was effective for millennia. Later king lists omitted Hatshepsut entirely, jumping from Thutmose II directly to Thutmose III. When ancient historians like Manetho compiled lists of Egyptian pharaohs, they didn't include her. For thousands of years, one of Egypt's most successful rulers was forgotten, her name unknown, her achievements unrecorded. Only in the 19th century, when archaeologists began deciphering the damaged inscriptions at Deir el-Bahari and piecing together her story from fragmentary evidence, was Hatshepsut rediscovered and her place in history restored. Hatshepsut wasn't the only woman to rule Egypt as pharaoh, though she was the most successful. Earlier, at the end of the 12th dynasty, around 1800 BCE, a woman named Sobekneferu ruled for approximately 4 years. She appears in king lists and on monuments wearing both female dress and pharaonic regalia. Her reign marked the end of the Middle Kingdom, a period of stability, giving way to chaos. Little is known about her reign, and no tomb has been identified as hers. Later, at the end of the 19th dynasty, around 1190 BCE, another woman seized power. Tawasret had been the wife of Seti II and regent for a young pharaoh, Siptah. When Siptah died, Tawasret declared herself pharaoh and ruled for about 2 years. Her reign ended the 19th dynasty, and like Sobekneferu, she presided over a period of instability and decline. Her successor, Setnakht, founder of the 20th dynasty, usurped her tomb and attempted to erase her monuments. And there may have been Neferneferuaten, the mysterious ruler who appeared briefly after Akhenaten's death. If this was indeed Nefertiti ruling under a throne name, as some scholars believe, then she too was a female pharaoh, though the evidence remains inconclusive. The most famous female ruler of Egypt, Cleopatra VII, came much later, at the very end of Egyptian independence. She ruled from 51 to 30 BCE, the last pharaoh before Egypt became a Roman province. Cleopatra was ethnically Greek, descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who had seized Egypt after Alexander's death. She was highly educated, politically astute, and formed famous alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But Roman propaganda portrayed her as a seductress who used her sexuality to manipulate Roman leaders, an image that has persisted in Western culture. The reality was more complex. She was a skilled ruler who fought to preserve Egyptian independence against overwhelming Roman power. She failed, and with her death, Egypt's 3,000-year history of pharaonic rule ended. What these female pharaohs reveal is both the possibilities and the limitations of female power in ancient Egypt. Egyptian culture, unlike many ancient societies, allowed women significant legal rights and social status. Women could own property, conduct business, and hold religious offices. In theory, nothing prevented a woman from ruling as pharaoh, yet in practice, female pharaohs were rare, and their reigns were often erased from memory. The role of pharaoh was so strongly associated with masculinity, the pharaoh as warrior, as father of the nation, as the embodiment of the male god Horus, that accommodating female rulers required ideological contortions and often provoked later attempts at erasure. Hatshepsut proved that a woman could rule Egypt as successfully as any man. Her reign was peaceful and prosperous. She built magnificent monuments. She expanded trade. She maintained Egypt's power and prestige. Yet this success wasn't enough to prevent her erasure. The fact that she ruled well didn't change the underlying assumption that pharaohs should be male. Her reign was treated as an aberration, a disruption of proper order that needed to be corrected in the historical record. The female pharaohs demonstrated that women could wield power effectively, but their later erasure demonstrated that Egyptian society, for all its relative progressiveness, still preferred to remember its rulers as men. Secrets in the sand. On a spring morning in 2021, archaeologists working near Luxor announced a discovery that captured worldwide attention. They had uncovered a large, well-preserved ancient city, buried beneath the sand, complete with walls still standing to a height of 10 feet, rooms filled with everyday objects, and workshops with tools still in place. The city dated to the reign of Amenhotep III, around 400 years ago, making it one of the largest and most complete ancient settlements ever found in Egypt. The excavation team called it the Lost Golden City, and its discovery demonstrated something that Egyptologists have known for years, but the public often forgets. Despite more than 2 centuries of intensive archaeological work, Egypt still holds countless secrets beneath its sand. The Golden City, officially called the Rise of Aten, had been hidden under the desert on the west bank of the Nile, between the temples of Ramesses III and Amenhotep III. Archaeologists had been searching for Tutankhamun's mortuary temple when they stumbled upon the settlement. Within weeks of beginning excavation, they realized they had found something extraordinary. The city appeared to have been abandoned suddenly, with objects left in place as if the inhabitants had simply walked away. There were bakeries with ovens still containing bread, workshops with pottery wheels, and tools, administrative buildings with storage jars bearing seals, and residential areas with intact walls and doorways. The preservation was remarkable. Mud brick walls, which normally deteriorate rapidly when exposed to the elements, stood nearly intact because they had been protected by the sand that buried them. The city's layout was clearly visible. Streets, houses, workshops, and administrative buildings organized in a planned settlement. Inscriptions on wine jars and other objects dated the city to the reign of Amenhotep III. and the early years of his son Akhenaten's reign, confirming that this was a major administrative and industrial center during one of Egypt's most prosperous periods. This discovery illustrates a fundamental truth about Egyptian archaeology. Most of ancient Egypt remains unexcavated. The monuments and tombs that tourists visit, the pyramids, the Valley of the Kings, the great temples represent only a fraction of what exists. Beneath the modern cities, agricultural fields, and desert sands lie countless settlements, cemeteries, and structures that haven't been discovered or excavated. Every year brings new finds that reshape our understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. Technology has revolutionized the search for these hidden sites. Satellite imagery, particularly infrared photography, can detect subtle differences in soil composition and vegetation patterns that indicate buried structures. In 2011, archaeologist Sarah Parcock used satellite data to identify 17 previously unknown pyramids, over 3,000 ancient settlements, and more than 1,000 tombs across Egypt. Most of these sites haven't been excavated yet, but their identification provides a roadmap for future archaeological work. Ground-penetrating radar has become another crucial tool. This technology sends radio waves into the ground and measures the reflections, creating images of buried structures without excavation. In recent years, radar surveys have been conducted at numerous Egyptian sites, revealing hidden chambers, tunnels, and structures. The controversial scans of Tutankhamun's tomb, searching for Nefertiti's burial chamber, used this technology, though with inconclusive results. More successful applications have mapped entire buried settlements and identified promising excavation sites. LiDAR light detection and ranging uses laser pulses to create detailed, three-dimensional maps of terrain. In forested areas, LiDAR can penetrate vegetation to reveal structures hidden beneath. While Egypt's desert environment doesn't require this capability, LiDAR has been used to create precise maps of known sites and to detect subtle features that aren't visible to the naked eye. These detailed maps help archaeologists understand site layouts and plan excavations more effectively. Muon tomography, the technology used to detect the void in the Great Pyramid in 2017, represents one of the most exciting recent developments. Muons are subatomic particles created when cosmic rays hit Earth's atmosphere. They pass through solid matter but are absorbed at different rates by different materials. By placing detectors inside a pyramid and measuring muon absorption patterns, researchers can detect hidden chambers without drilling or excavation. The void discovered in the Great Pyramid, a space approximately 100 feet long, remains mysterious. Is it a chamber, a structural feature, a corridor without direct access? We can only speculate. But the discovery demonstrates that even the most studied monuments in Egypt may still contain surprises. DNA analysis continues to yield new information from old discoveries. Mummies that were excavated decades or even centuries ago can now be studied using genetic techniques that didn't exist when they were found. Recent studies have extracted DNA from mummies of common Egyptians, not just royalty, providing information about the genetic makeup of the ancient Egyptian population and how it changed over time. These studies have revealed migration patterns, family relationships, and the prevalence of genetic disorders in the general population. Chemical analysis of artifacts and mummies has become increasingly sophisticated. Researchers can now identify the geographic origin of materials with remarkable precision. Analysis of the resins used in mummification can determine which forests they came from, revealing trade networks spanning thousands of miles. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth can show where individuals lived at different times in their lives and what they ate, providing insights into diet migration and social stratification. In 2017, archaeologists working at Saqqara, the vast necropolis near Cairo, discovered a tomb belonging to a high priest named Wade, dating to the 5th dynasty, around 2500 BCE. The tomb was exceptionally well preserved, with vibrant painted reliefs covering the walls and numerous statues still in place. What made this discovery particularly significant was its completeness. The tomb appeared never to have been robbed, a rarity for Egyptian tombs. The excavation is ongoing, and archaeologists expect to find burial shafts beneath the main chambers that may contain mummies and grave goods. Also at Saqqara in 2020, archaeologists announced the discovery of more than 100 sealed coffins, some containing mummies, in burial shafts dating to the late period around 500 BCE. The coffins were remarkably well preserved, their colors still vivid after 2,500 years. Many remained sealed, offering the rare opportunity to study burials that haven't been disturbed since antiquity. CT scans of the sealed coffins revealed mummies, inside some with elaborate cartonnage masks and amulets. The discovery continues, with new coffins being found as excavation progresses. These recent discoveries at Saqqara have been particularly fruitful because the site is vast and has never been completely excavated. Saqqara served as a burial ground for Memphis, Egypt's capital, during the Old Kingdom, and remained in use for thousands of years. The site covers approximately 4 square miles and contains tombs from every period of Egyptian history. Despite more than a century of archaeological work, much of Saqqara remains unexplored, and new discoveries are made regularly. Climate change poses new challenges and opportunities for Egyptian archaeology. Rising groundwater tables caused by changes in Nile management and irrigation practices threaten many sites. Water seeping into tombs damages paintings and causes stone to deteriorate. The temples at Luxor and Karnak face ongoing problems with rising water levels. Conservation efforts struggle to keep pace with the damage. At the same time, changing water levels sometimes expose sites that were previously inaccessible, creating opportunities for new discoveries. Modern construction and development also reveal ancient sites. When workers dig foundations for new buildings or infrastructure projects in Egyptian cities, they frequently encounter ancient remains. In 2017, a massive statue of Ramesses II was discovered in a Cairo slum buried in groundwater. The statue, weighing several tons, was carefully excavated and moved to a museum. Such discoveries are bittersweet. They reveal important artifacts, but they also highlight how much has been lost to urban development over the years. The Egyptian government has become more restrictive about excavation permits in recent decades, partly to preserve sites for future generations with better technology. This is a wise policy. Excavation is destructive by nature, and techniques that seem careful today may appear crude to future archaeologists. By leaving sites unexcavated, Egypt ensures that future researchers with more advanced technology can study them. However, this policy must be balanced against the need to excavate sites threatened by development looting or environmental damage. Digital archaeology has created new ways to preserve and study sites. High-resolution photography, 3D scanning, and photogrammetry can create detailed digital models of monuments and artifacts. These models preserve information about sites as they exist today, creating a record that will remain even if the physical sites deteriorate. Virtual reality technology allows people to explore Egyptian sites, remotely reducing the physical impact of tourism on fragile monuments. Some damaged or destroyed sites have been digitally reconstructed, allowing researchers to study them as they once existed. The discovery of new papyri continues to provide textual evidence about ancient Egypt. In 2013, archaeologists discovered papyri at Wadi el-Jarf on the Red Sea coast that included the journal of an official named Merer, who worked on the Great Pyramid during the reign of Khufu. These papyri, the oldest ever found in Egypt, provide the only contemporary written account of pyramid construction. They describe the organization of work crews, the transportation of limestone blocks, and the administrative systems that supported these massive projects. The discovery answered some questions about pyramid construction while raising new ones. Underwater archaeology has revealed another dimension of ancient Egypt. The Mediterranean coast has risen and fallen over millennia, and several ancient cities now lie beneath the sea. The cities of Thonis Heracleion and Canopus, important ports during the late period, were submerged by rising sea levels and earthquakes. French archaeologist Frank Godiot has been excavating these underwater sites since the 1990s, discovering temples, statues, ships, and everyday objects preserved in the Mediterranean mud. These underwater sites provide unique insights into Egypt's maritime trade and its connections with the Greek and Roman worlds. What all these discoveries demonstrate is that our understanding of ancient Egypt remains incomplete and constantly evolving. Each new find adds pieces to the puzzle, sometimes confirming what we thought we knew, sometimes forcing us to revise our understanding entirely. The Golden City discovered in 2021 has already changed our understanding of Amenhotep III's reign and the transition to Akhenaten's period. Future discoveries will undoubtedly bring more surprises, more revisions, more questions. The sand that buried and preserved these sites for millennia continues to yield its secrets slowly. Modern technology accelerates the pace of discovery, but excavation remains painstaking work requiring patience, skill, and careful documentation. Every artifact, every inscription, every structure adds to our knowledge, but also reminds us how much remains unknown. The secrets in the sand are not just about what we haven't found yet, but about what we haven't understood about what we have found. Ancient Egypt continues to speak to us across the millennia, but we're still learning its language, still deciphering its messages, still uncovering the stories buried beneath the sand. Echoes of eternity. More than 3,000 years have passed since Tutankhamun was sealed in his tomb, since Ramesses the Great carved his name across Egypt's monuments, since the priests hid the royal mummies in their secret cache. The civilization that built the pyramids developed hieroglyphic writing and created the science of mummification has long since vanished. The language the ancient Egyptians spoke is no longer heard. Their gods are no longer worshipped. Their cities lie in ruins or buried beneath modern settlements. Yet in a profound way, the ancient Egyptians achieved exactly what they sought, a form of immortality that has outlasted empires, religions, and civilizations. We speak their names, study their lives, preserve their bodies, and stand in awe before their monuments. The pharaohs wanted to be remembered forever. They succeeded, though not in the way they imagined. The ancient Egyptians spent enormous resources pursuing immortality. They built massive tombs designed to last for eternity. They developed sophisticated preservation techniques to protect their bodies from decay. They filled their burials with treasures meant to sustain them in the afterlife. They covered tomb walls with spells and instructions for navigating the underworld. They believed that if the body was preserved, if the proper rituals were performed, if the correct spells were recited, they would awaken. In the field of reeds, a paradise where the sun always shone, crops grew abundantly, and the blessed dead lived in eternal peace. As far as we can tell, this didn't happen. No pharaoh woke in a physical afterlife. The spells on the tomb walls didn't transport them to another realm. The treasures they accumulated didn't accompany them to paradise. The elaborate preparations, the enormous expense, the careful preservation, all of it failed to achieve its intended purpose. The ancient Egyptians were wrong about the afterlife, at least in the literal sense they imagined it. Yet they achieved something remarkable nonetheless. Tutankhamun, a minor king who accomplished little during his brief reign, is now more famous than most modern world leaders. His golden mask is one of the most recognizable images in the world. Millions of people have viewed his treasures in museums. His name is known on every continent. He has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and exhibitions. In 1972, when his treasures toured the United States, more than 8 million people came to see them. The exhibition generated unprecedented public interest in ancient Egypt and inspired a new generation of Egyptologists. A pharaoh who died in obscurity more than 3,000 years ago has achieved global fame that continues to grow. Ramesses II carved his name so deeply into stone that later pharaohs couldn't erase it. He built monuments so massive that they still dominate the landscape. He created propaganda so effective that we still call him the Great, more than 3 millennia after his death. His mummy, preserved by ancient embalmers and protected by modern conservation, can be seen by anyone who visits Cairo. His face, leathery and ancient but recognizable, gazes at visitors with the same prominent nose and strong features visible in his statues. He wanted to be remembered as Egypt's greatest pharaoh. By many measures, he succeeded. Hatshepsut's monuments were defaced, her name erased from king lists, her memory deliberately suppressed. Yet today, she is recognized as one of Egypt's most successful rulers. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari is one of the country's most visited sites. Her story of a woman who seized power in a male-dominated society resonates with modern audiences. The attempt to erase her from history ultimately failed. She has been rediscovered, restored to her rightful place in Egyptian history, and celebrated as a pioneer who proved that women could rule as effectively as men. Even the anonymous craftsmen who built these monuments have achieved a form of immortality. We don't know their names, but we know where they lived. The village of Deir el-Medina has been extensively excavated, revealing details of their daily lives. We know what they earned, what they ate, what they argued about, even what jokes they told preserved on the ostraca they left behind. These ordinary people, who never expected to be remembered, are now studied by scholars and featured in museum exhibitions. Their lives, preserved in archaeological evidence, speak to us across the millennia. The mummies themselves have become something the ancient Egyptians never anticipated: scientific resources that teach us about disease, diet, genetics, and daily life in ways no text could. They reveal that pharaohs suffered from arthritis, dental problems, malaria, and genetic disorders. They show us that the divine kings were human, after all, subject to the same physical limitations and health problems that affect all humans. This humanity doesn't diminish the pharaohs, it makes their achievements more impressive. They built monuments that have outlasted empires, developed technologies that wouldn't be matched for millennia, and created art of stunning beauty, all while dealing with chronic pain, disease, and the knowledge that death was inevitable. Modern science has given the ancient Egyptians a different kind of afterlife than they imagined. Through CT scans, we can see inside their bodies without unwrapping them. Through DNA analysis, we can map their family relationships and identify their diseases. Through chemical analysis, we can determine what they ate, where they lived, and what materials they used. The mummies speak to us not through the spells written on tomb walls, but through the biological information preserved in their tissues. They tell us stories about ancient Egypt that the pharaohs themselves never knew, stories written in bone and DNA, in dental abscesses and arterial plaque, in the genetic markers of inherited disorders. The monuments the pharaohs built have also achieved immortality, though they have been transformed by time. The pyramids, intended as sealed tombs, are now tourist attractions visited by millions. The Valley of the Kings, meant to be a secret burial ground, is one of Egypt's most famous sites. The temples built for gods no longer worshipped are studied for their architecture and art. These monuments have survived not because they fulfilled their original purpose, but because they're magnificent achievements of human engineering and artistry that transcend their original religious context. Perhaps what draws us to ancient Egypt is precisely this tension between ambition and mortality, between the eternal and the ephemeral. The ancient Egyptians refused to accept death as final. They built for eternity, planned for immortality, and created technologies to defeat decay. They partially succeeded. Their monuments still stand. Their mummies still exist. Their names are still spoken. But they also failed. No pharaoh lives in paradise. No spell granted eternal life. No amount of gold could purchase immortality in the way they imagined. Yet there's something profoundly moving about their attempt. The ancient Egyptians looked at death, the one certainty that faces every human, and said, "No, we will not accept this. We will build monuments that outlast our lives. We will preserve our bodies against decay. We will write our names in stone so deeply that time cannot erase them." This defiance of mortality, this refusal to be forgotten, resonates across cultures and millennia. We understand the impulse even if we don't share their specific beliefs about the afterlife. Modern visitors to Egypt often report feeling a sense of connection with the ancient past. Standing before the pyramids, walking through the Valley of the Kings, viewing the mummies in museums, these experiences create a bridge across time. We're looking at structures built by people who died thousands of years ago, yet their work remains. We're seeing the actual bodies of pharaohs preserved by techniques developed in the Bronze Age. We're reading inscriptions carved by craftsmen whose names we'll never know. The past feels tangible, immediate, real. This connection is part of what the ancient Egyptians achieved. They wanted to be remembered, and they are. They wanted their works to endure, and they have. They wanted to defeat death, and in a sense they did not by living forever themselves, but by creating things that would outlast them. The pyramids are tombs, but they're also monuments to human ambition and engineering skill. The mummies are corpses, but they're also time capsules, preserving information about ancient life. The inscriptions are religious texts, but they're also literature that still moves readers today. The story of the pharaohs and their mummies is ultimately a human story. It's about people who face the same fundamental questions we face. What happens after death? How can we be remembered? What legacy will we leave? The ancient Egyptians answered these questions with pyramids and mummies, with elaborate rituals, and beautiful art with monuments that still stand after thousands of years. Their answers were different from ours, but the questions were the same. We continue to discover new things about ancient Egypt, to refine our understanding, to correct our misconceptions. Each new technology, X-rays, CT scans, DNA analysis, satellite imagery, reveals information that previous generations couldn't access. Future technologies will undoubtedly reveal even more. The ancient Egyptians left us an enormous amount of evidence, monuments, mummies, artifacts, inscriptions, and we're still learning to read it all, still deciphering the messages they left behind. The pharaohs sought eternal life in the field of reeds, a paradise they believed awaited them after death. They didn't find it there. Instead, they found it in museums, in textbooks, in documentaries, in the minds of people who study and admire their achievements thousands of years later. This wasn't the immortality they planned for, but it's immortality nonetheless. Their names are spoken, their faces are known, their stories are told. The echoes of their civilization reverberate through time, growing fainter but never quite fading, reminding us that while individuals die, what they create can endure. In the end, the ancient Egyptians teach us something important about mortality and memory. Death is universal and inevitable. Every pharaoh died. Every pyramid became a tomb. Every mummy is a corpse. But memory can be eternal, or at least very long-lasting. The monuments we build, the works we create, the knowledge we preserve, these can outlast us by millennia. The pharaohs wanted to live forever. They didn't, but their memory has, and perhaps that's the only immortality any of us can truly achieve. The secrets of the pharaohs and their mummies continue to speak across the ages, not from an afterlife in the field of reeds, but from the tombs, monuments, and preserved bodies. They left behind echoes of eternity that remind us that, while death is certain, being forgotten is not. Over the past hours, we've journeyed through more than 3,000 years of Egyptian history, exploring the lives, deaths, and legacies of the pharaohs who ruled one of humanity's greatest civilizations. We began with Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, that rare moment when an intact royal burial revealed its treasures to the modern world. We examined what modern science has discovered beneath the golden mask, a young man weakened by genetic disorders, struggling with pain and disease. We investigated the famous curse separating sensational fiction from the real biological dangers that ancient tombs can harbor. We explored Akhenaten's radical attempt to transform Egyptian religion, a revolution that failed but created the circumstances that preserved his son's tomb for millennia. We followed the mystery of Nefertiti, the powerful queen who vanished from history, her burial place still unknown despite decades of searching. We learned about the sophisticated science of mummification, a technology refined over centuries to preserve bodies for eternity. We discovered what CT scans and DNA analysis reveal when we look beneath the wrappings, which have some evidence of disease, injury, family relationships, and the genetic consequences of royal inbreeding. We met Ramesses the Great, whose 66-year reign and massive building projects made him ancient Egypt's most prolific pharaoh. We uncovered the dramatic story of the royal mummy cache, where priests hid dozens of pharaohs to protect them from tomb robbers. We explored the Valley of the Kings itself, that remote desert valley, where pharaohs tried and largely failed to protect their burials from plunder. We examined how DNA analysis has rewritten royal family trees and revealed the biological costs of keeping bloodlines pure. We encountered the remarkable women who ruled as pharaohs, particularly Hatshepsut, whose successful reign was later erased from monuments. We surveyed recent discoveries that continue to emerge from the sand, reminding us how much remains unknown. And finally, we reflected on what the pharaohs achieved, not the immortality they sought in the field of reeds, but a different kind of eternity, their names and works enduring across millennia. What emerges from this exploration is a portrait of ancient Egypt that's more complex and human than the popular image of golden treasures and mysterious curses. The pharaohs presented themselves as gods eternal and perfect, but the evidence reveals them as people suffering from arthritis and dental problems, dying from infections and genetic disorders, struggling with the same mortality that faces all humans. Yet this humanity doesn't diminish their achievements. If anything, it makes them more impressive. They built monuments that still stand after thousands of years. They developed technologies that wouldn't be matched for millennia. They created art of stunning beauty. And they did all this while dealing with chronic pain, disease, and the certain knowledge that death was inevitable. The story of the pharaohs and their mummies matters because it reveals something fundamental about human nature: our refusal to accept death as final, our drive to create things that outlast us, our need to be remembered. The ancient Egyptians looked at mortality and said no. They would build for eternity. They would preserve their bodies against decay. They would carve their names so deeply in stone that time couldn't erase them. They partially succeeded. Their monuments endure. Their mummies exist. Their names are spoken. This wasn't the immortality they imagined, but it's immortality nonetheless. History is not static. Our understanding of ancient Egypt continues to evolve with each new discovery, each technological advance, each mummy studied, with methods that didn't exist a generation ago. The Golden City, discovered in 2021, remarkably preserved beneath the sand. The ongoing DNA analysis revealing family relationships and genetic disorders. The satellite imagery identifying buried sites not yet excavated. The conservation efforts protecting monuments from environmental damage. the debate over whether hidden chambers exist behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. All of this reminds us that Egyptology is a living field with new questions constantly emerging, and old certainties sometimes overturned by new evidence. We're drawn to ancient Egypt perhaps because it represents humanity at its most ambitious. Here was a civilization that refused to accept limits, that built on a scale that still impresses us, that developed sophisticated technologies, and created beauty that endures across millennia. The pyramids stand as monuments to human engineering and determination. The mummies demonstrate a remarkable understanding of chemistry and preservation. The art speaks across cultural and temporal boundaries. Ancient Egypt reminds us of what humans can achieve when we commit fully to a vision, even if that vision, eternal life in a physical paradise, proved impossible to realize. Studying the past gives us perspective on the present. It reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, that what seems permanent is temporary, that even the mightiest empires eventually crumble. But it also shows us that what we create can outlast us. The pharaohs are gone, their civilization vanished, their gods no longer worshipped. Yet their works remain, speaking to us across the void of time, teaching us about their world, and in the process, teaching us about ourselves. Thank you for taking this journey through ancient Egypt. If you found value in this exploration, there are other stories from history waiting to be discovered, other civilizations whose secrets still echo across time. But for now, let the images of golden masks and painted tomb walls, of desert valleys and ancient mummies fade gently into rest. The pharaohs sought eternity and found it in unexpected ways. Their story is complete for tonight. May you find the peace they sought. Good night.